I have dreamed of first contact with alien life since I first read a science fiction novel when I was 8 years old," Gabriel said with quiet horror in his voice as his wide eyes stared in disbelief at what he was seeing. "I thought that somewhere out there in the endless stars we would find new friends, new dreamers, and that we could adventure through the night sea in camaraderie and friendship. That's why I named that ship Friendship in the first place. I never dreamed this." His quiet words fell like a hammer on the spirits of those who watched the screen. Aliens, strangely beautiful in a way, with multicolored wings and round heads, rushed forward on 4 legs, and with a long, curling tongue-like organ stabbed the bodies of the scientists on board the exploratory vessel. Friendship. The screams were not short-lived, as the aliens rose up, yanked the frail bodies of the scientists towards them, and then began to tear into their flesh. The sound of snapping limbs was drowned out only by the cries of agony and pleas for mercy from the crew. Gabriel could only watch, along with the rest of his people, as the scientists and the ship's crew were dissected alive by the dark curiosity of the fiendish invaders. Cameras were everywhere on exploratory vessels, and so there wasn't a single detail to be missed. Not one desperate flail, not one heart-wrenching wail, not one little cry as someone was allowed, blessedly, to die. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Gabriel trembled as his friends perished before his eyes. Most of them were known to him since their earliest days in the academy. All of them, on the day of the launch, he'd envied for their chance to sail between the stars in search of new life and new civilizations, going so boldly out where no human had ever gone before. And this is their reward. He gritted his teeth as if their anguish ended his, and birthed rage in its place. Only a handful of crew members survived long enough that the aliens who boarded the ship decided to leave with them. The recording automation on the ship worked even without people, and so he and the rest of the horrified staff could watch as the long, almost caterpillar-shaped ships began to pull away. They could only watch as the weapons turned on the Terran ship, glowed, and then fired. The detonation cut off the transmission and denied the dead even the dignity of burial at home, leaving whatever scraps of them to survive the blast to float in the icy and endless void of space until the end of time. "We have the transmission." "All of it?" Gabriel asked as sweat ran down his face. "We do," the intern said. Tears were on his face. Gabriel could see them out of the corner of his eye. The young man had made friends with some of the crew before launch, even expressed interest in joining them on one of their missions one day. And now that wasn't going to happen. They destroy our friendship. I suppose only time will tell if they regret it or not, Gabriel said as steel resolve settled into his gut. He turned and put his hand on the shoulder of the pimply-faced young intern. "Lad, route that transmission to the global news networks, then upload it to the Common Usenet and to the President in that order." "But, sir," the young man sniffled and wiped a bit of snot from his nose, "aren't we supposed to route it to the government first?" "You're right, and you'll be fired for following my orders because I'm going to deny giving them. But if you do as I tell you, there's a good chance that we'll at least be able to return the greeting those aliens gave to us. If you don't, it'll get buried, maybe even lied about, and they'll all be forgotten." "Sir, when I get fired, can you get me a job somewhere else?" the young man asked, and at that, Gabriel nodded. "Making twice what you're making here, I can promise you that," he said, and then watched as the young intern hastened away. His feet were the only noise in the room. Gabriel had no doubt his words had been heard by a dozen or more people, but the people on the Friendship had been their friends too, and outrage or revenge or both would be enough to buy their silent cooperation. An hour later, news organization notices buzzed on phones all over the world. "This footage will be sensitive to most viewers. Please do not watch this where children may observe." It was the sort of warning that guaranteed people would check out the subject, and so the screams of the dying were heard all over Earth, and phones began to ring as scientists were called for commentary. Gabriel didn't bother to check to see what the video hosting services were doing. he simply went into his private office, sat down, and removed his phone from his pocket. It was warm to the touch, no doubt from one of the little mobile games he sometimes played to pass the time. He set it on the desk and looked down at it. He didn't have to wait long. It buzzed angrily up at him, shaking enough that it actually moved a few inches across the shiny, flat wooden surface. Gabriel tapped the screen to answer the call and set it on speaker. "Dr. Coleman, have you lost your goddamn mind?" Gabriel took a deep breath and looked at the screen. It was a video call. "No, Mr. President, not at all. A man who had, as you so eloquently put it, lost his goddamn mind, would have sent that to you without making damn sure it wasn't forgotten." President Whitman's tanned face was red with anger as he snapped back. "You're taking this too personally. Do you know what kind of panic you just set off?" "I'm sure I have a clue about their panic, and you're damn right I take it personally. The friendship was my idea. How could I not take it personally that all those friends and colleagues of mine died?" President Ronald Whitman stood up and set his hands on the desk, and as if to challenge the larger, younger man across the miles, Dr. Gabriel Coleman stood up in the same way and hovered over the phone so he was looking down at it. "People are going to demand action. That's billions, maybe trillions in defense credits. We don't even know where these aliens are or how dangerous they are, or—" He stopped when Gabriel held up a finger. "We do have a good idea about that." Gabriel answered. That brought the president up short. "What do you mean? How could you possibly know any of that?" "For starters, Mr. President, our power readings indicated that their engine efficiency was far below our own, and we encountered them in an area with nothing else around it, indicating that this was also outside of their territory. The weapon readings we were able to record were also far below our current capabilities. It may be that they have a colony nearby, but if it were so far advanced that we had some reason to worry, we should have picked up some kind of signal." Gabriel laid his points out in plain language, and the red anger began to drain from Whitman's slightly pudgy face. Could those have been, I don't know, pirates? Brigands of some sort? Perhaps a criminal element not affiliated with whatever government they have? The president's question was a good one, and Gabriel shrugged. "I can't say. It certainly didn't look like it was in the state of repair you'd expect out of space pirates. But how likely is it that space pirates will ever be a real thing anyway?" "No. I believe our starship just had the misfortune to travel into the path of a very hostile people who, like ourselves, are just beginning to seize the stars. Just as our star harvesters are creating energy banks to fuel the hyperlanes, and our terraformers are preparing worlds to become ideal homes for us, I believe they are trying to expand their borders themselves." Gabriel tried to sound more confident than he was, and in that, he was well practiced. In truth, he had his doubts. But in that short recording of data, it was indisputable that there were no forms of energy banks. The enemy vessel was not as advanced as those of Earth's military, and there was no sign of civilization in any of the other star systems they'd visited in the previous 7 years. Also in his favor, or rather Earth's favor, the Friendship was one of the small fleet of 7 science vessels meant to explore far beyond the fleet of construction ships in part of a multi-stage plan of expansion and settlement. The science vessels would go out, scan for life and habitats, identify and tag useful resources, and then, after transmitting their findings to the construction fleet, move on. Then the construction fleet would follow, establish a starbase that would harvest energy from the local sun, build mining and harvesting operations, and then drop the autoformer on the desired worlds, then transmit the locations back to Earth before moving on again. Then back on Earth, everyone who registered as a would-be colonist would receive a notice of opportunity, a map of the area, and a projection of what it would look like when the planet had been turned into a new Eden in which to live. The colonists would then buy land that would build the colony ship, and when after a few years the terraforming was complete, the colony ship would launch and settle on a new world. It's worked very well so far. We haven't expended too much in the way of money. We haven't wasted our resources, and we haven't needed to put much into the military beyond improving what we could build. But now, after that, Gabriel shivered again. The call for a military buildup and to punish those aliens would be inexorable. Ronald had calmed down at last after the minute of silence settled between them. No doubt he'd been coming to the same conclusion. We'll raise armies and start building a fleet immediately. Transmit the designs I know you've been working on off to the Defense Department as soon as possible. I have to go and address the world. The president sighed, and Gabriel felt his first twinge of guilt. I'm sorry to put you into this position, Ron, but I can't regret having done it. I'll throw some favorable commentary your way when I do my interview. Gabriel promised and sat back down. His chair squeaked under him, and he picked up the phone to hold it at eye level. Don't worry about it, the president remarked. I might have done the same thing. Hell of a way to die. But at least it wasn't in vain. These fiends really showed their hand early. We'll make them pay for that, even if it takes years to get ready. In the meantime, I'll assign people to learning their language, and we'll get more ships commissioned, and hopefully we'll catch these bastards napping, see how they like being boarded when the time comes. Yes, sir, Mr. President, Dr. Coleman replied, and the call came to a close when the president hung up. It felt strange to get up the next day, and the next, and the next. If any of the others felt the same as himself, they didn't say it. But for Gabriel Coleman, it was strange to think of human corpses, burnt ruins and ashes of ambition and humanity, floating through space billions of miles from the planet they evolved on. And worse, that it happened because of some other chance evolutionary path on a world no human had ever seen. Life continued to carry on, and shipyards continued to expand until they were capable of harboring the massive battleships that were now much more than merely conceptual plans. They were real, physical, tangible things, and tours of them and their shipyards became a popular way to help fund their creation. It was 2 years later that the aliens became the go-to villain in video games and popular media. But Gabriel only went about his day, avoiding all of it, only briefly appearing in a documentary, End in the Void, depicting the lives and deaths of the people aboard the Friendship. Only one other exception occupied his time and study, and that was going to see the dramatization of the documentary. Not half bad. Except for Fred was gay and Alice didn't have a crush on him. They'd be mortified to know the director made that decision just because the actor and actress had chemistry together on screen. Other than that, they'd have been pleased. All of them. It was a good enough film to win a few awards. Best Picture, Best Special Effects. But what really mattered in Gabriel's mind, as well as in the OPO, Office of Public Opinion, was how the film shaped the perspectives and views of humans not just on Earth, but on the outlying colonies that were growing more important every day. New signals were coming in from the most distant star systems, and as Gabriel sat at his desk again almost 9 years to the day after the first encounter with alien life, he could foresee future first contacts with yet more alien life in the deep Black Sea. How many peoples are there? What if they're all as dangerous as the other ones? What if they're more advanced than we are? What if we can't make it? He asked himself that a lot. Extinction. The word hung like a sword of Damocles above the entire race of man, though outside of a handful of scientists, politicians, and military personnel, almost nobody knew of the other transmissions out there. Not yet. But language experts were closing in on the ability to speak with those new civilizations, even though most were focused on the one known to be hostile. He flipped on the local news on the common net and watched the newscasters standing on the flight deck. The Star Fleet behind me is ready to launch in 1 hour, and when it does, it will make its way to the site of the destruction of the starship Friendship. Once there, they will attempt to gather any remains they can, before setting off to find the fiend boarders. After that, what happens is up to them again. It was an ominous thing to say, but most people didn't really know much about the aliens designated as the fiends. As such, there were a great many humans who feared the idea of conflict, wondering openly if one ship wasn't just an acceptable loss, and whether or not they should make peace, if they could. Both perspectives favored having a strong fleet, but the war between anger and fear had yet to end. Traveling out that far would take years more, and as such, most of the journey would be spent in a state of cryosleep for the crew. Gabriel shook his head. Madness. They had to have been searching for life as long as we have. What insanity is it to do that? Just to tear your brothers and sisters in the stars to pieces. A war fought between neighbors makes sense, but we're so far from one another. He stopped that train of thought. The engines and travel methods of hyperlanes meant that far away was now being redefined. Anywhere on Earth was now only an hour away, and the time it took to get to other colonies on other worlds was now the same amount of time it once took for their ancestors to go from the east to west coast of North America. What will neighbors mean in another 100 years? Gabriel wondered, and got back to work preparing for the hell the future would bring to the people who slew his colleagues. Admiral Shaya of the Ediaxa Empire stared at the screen in disbelief. "Another pink one?" He asked nobody in particular, and then his tongue stiffened as if to stab someone as the alien's words began to flow, not in the language of the pink ones, but in his own. "The United Earth Empire sends its greetings, fiends. I am Admiral John Yamamoto. You perhaps remember us from the destruction and slaughter of our peaceful science ship, the Friendship, some time ago. We bore witness to your atrocities, and we remember. Now we send our welcome to you in return, and now you will express your remorse, hand over those responsible, or if you will not express an apology to us, you will express your regrets to one another." Admiral Shaya's wings shivered. "Where did this transmission come from?" he demanded, and a subordinate seated nearby tapped the screen. "Here, sir," he replied and revealed the transmission source. "We'll send them lasers, not regrets." The Admiral wiggled with his amusement. "Send out some ships to that star system. Treat the creatures like the last time. They're the hardiest experimental animals we've ever had. It took 2 years to finish off that last batch." 6 vessels, each one the size of a village, winked out of view as they jumped into the hyperlane and towards the alien infestation on the border, coming all the way to the same place just to die all over again. They're even dumber than a Buxani. He thought of the subjected species that had been so recently conquered. "On screen. I want to watch the..." He didn't get to finish the sentence before his tongue stiffened in horror. His wings began to shake, and his was not alone. The fear breeze swept through the entire room as the wings of every Ediaxa shivered enough to make their air move about. The cause? The battleships on screen were hundreds of times the size of the small science vessel that had been previously destroyed, and there were dozens upon dozens of them. No, it can't be. It can't be. He felt his body release its waste onto the floor between his feet, as the long ships of the pink ones identified as Terrans began to glow at the gun ports. "Get them out of there," the Admiral shouted, but the order was needless. The Ediaxa vessels were dwarfed by the massive ships, and as horrified or worse than the Admiral himself. They were scrambling, firing off their weapons as they wheeled about to return to the hyperlane distortion. For one mad moment, Admiral Shaya hoped against hope that he would watch the Terran vessels explode like the science ship before it, only for the shots to strike at some invisible field which briefly glowed with iridescent light, revealing that they had some knowledge of shield technology. And worse, that it was enough to stop at least a handful of attacks by lasers and torpedoes. The Terran ships revealed that the guns fired projectiles or blasts of white light, easily larger than the ships they were firing at, and without fail they hit their marks. The Ediaxa vessels exploded in balls of white flame for a brief moment, and that was all the Admiral saw, before the transmission of the Terran began again. "This is Admiral John Yamamoto of Task Force Vengeance. Since you have ignored our warning and engaged in hostilities a second time, the price of our peace will be all of the energy harvesting stations surrounding your core worlds. And make no mistake, I am not asking you to cede them. I am informing you that we are coming to collect them. Any members of your crew still found on board those stations will be sent home within however long it takes for their body to float through space and hit the atmosphere of your home world. That is all. Contact the Kaksak. Inform her. We are at war with the Terrans." The Admiral gave the directions to his subordinate, and focused his own efforts on calming down as much as possible before he would have to address the assembly himself. "We are the Ediaxa. We have never been defeated. We can't lose like this. We can't. We can. Not. He told himself with frantic urgency as he batted his wings enough to fly out of the room and back to his office, repeating his denials while the memory of those battleships in his mind roared forward toward the debris of his punitive force, dared to argue quite convincingly that he was wrong. Admiral Yamamoto gave a quiet nod in the direction of the screen. The bursts of light flared and died in the dark, the same as the Starship Friendship years before. His stony expression never changed as the lights died under the wave of darkness. His tongue was bound by the sanctity and brutality of the moment. His hands remained folded behind his back, and he recalled one of the horror movies he saw in theaters that came out 3 years after the destruction of Friendship at first contact. In it, the destruction of the Ediaxa ships failed to kill those who sailed within, and they flew in to attack the Terran ship, resulting in fierce fighting and the hunting down of most of the men and women on board. Why do I love such god-awful movies? He asked himself with a shake of his head, but he then glanced in the direction of the sensor operator and said aloud, "Life signs?" "None, sir." The answer was calm and professional, as was to be expected of their bridge officers. But out of the corner of his eye, the Admiral saw the little smile on the man's face. "Did you lose someone?" John asked with quiet reverence and a hint of curiosity, and the Major answered at once, "My big brother." The officer's response was no surprise. Some of their top performers were relatives who joined the new Defense Force, specifically in the hopes of avenging what was done to a loved one. The Admiral didn't offer condolences. Most people had heard enough of those over the years. Instead, he gave a slight tug to his uniform and reseated himself. "Helm, adjust course. Head to the nearest Yadyaxa system. They have an energy collector that we need to collect." The Admiral's order was followed by the feeling of the starship banking slightly toward the hyperlane, and the brief feeling of acceleration before the dampeners could cycle out the force and the stars became a blur. They went from dots to lines as the fleet streaked through the night along the thickened space lanes. It would still take 3 months of travel to reach their destination, but he had one advantage he was sure the Yadyaxa did not. "We've got a good idea of their territory, and I'm certain they have no idea what Earth has been up to these last 7 years. Oh well, they fucked around. Now they find out." Admiral Shaya's mind was haunted by the absolute destruction of their punitive force. But he took comfort in the fact that the Kaksak was a wise female, whose guidance had never steered them wrong in the past. The Hulians, the Matrak, the Lorxa, all gave their territory a wide berth because of her aggressive policy of destroying vessels that entered territory the Yadyaxa desired. However bad things might have seemed, they could be worse. "We still have the rest of the armada, and we have our shipyards fully automated. They began building vessels as soon as the first ones were destroyed. Also, they must supply themselves from afar." Those were comforting thoughts to cling to as he stilled his wings and lowered his whole body to the floor in front of the Cax's throne, and gave his report of events. The throne room of their homeworld was a dimly lit place. It kept the vibrant colors of visitors dulled, but the throne was the exception. There, light was always streaming through a series of windows which angled the light directly toward the throne and nowhere else. As a result, the ruler was always the brightest in the room, a display that never failed to put others into a state of awe. And it did not fail now as he explained it all and awaited her answer. "We will meet them with swarms. Their ships are large and powerful," she admitted, "but they fire few shots. If they cannot hit, they cannot kill. We need only be many, and in this way the bugs may conquer the beast." She didn't lose her temper. Though the long tongue that vibrated out her words was stiffer than usual, he couldn't help but admire her collected state, and the rapidity with which she came up with a strategy that might have some possibility of success. "I will see to it personally, my Kaksa," the Admiral vowed, and she only fluttered her wings in acknowledgement. The bright colors danced along the floor thanks to the rainbow her wings created, and he crawled back out the way he'd come to prepare to resist the alien invaders. Mentally, Shaya had already cast off any hope of defending the first solar collection stations, and he ordered only skeleton crews of expendable ne'er-do-wells to be left behind to put up at least a show of defiance. The little fleets were ordered to pull back while the shipyards went into overdrive, churning out small, cheap frigates that required little to no crew, while also adding a small number of slightly more powerful vessels that still had less in terms of firepower and more in terms of maneuverability in their favor. Day after day he prepared. Working with only his most trusted aides, he watched every transmission that came his way. In the second lunar cycle of the homeworld, he saw the human fleet emerge from the hyperlane and go straight for the collector. It had few weapons, only enough to defend against pirates or destroy asteroids that came their way, which meant 2 platforms and a central rotating gun connected to the power core. The humans bathed the guns in the light of their weapons and then docked their ships. Shaya swapped to the internal monitors to watch the battle. In contrast to the soft bodies of the frail prey, he remembered, these were almost a different breed. Large, powerfully built, and clad in thick armor, the human marines carried large guns tipped with sharp blades. They shouted as they came on, their weapons spitting bright beams down the hall, and Shaya felt a core of fear grow in his gut. The human marines were moving in small teams that seemed to have been drilled on how to maneuver through the halls of a Yadiaxa construct. How did they know this much? He wondered. It just didn't seem likely that they would coincidentally use the same construction methods as his people. They've studied us somehow, figured out how we build. He felt vaguely ill as he watched the professional motion of the soldiers who moved in a leapfrog pattern, with 2 on the walls firing with 1 standing and kneeling, then 4 in the center moving up under suppressive fire on the wings. The center group would then provide fire for the next 2 to move up, and the halls were captured 1 by 1, and 2 by 2 until the last expendable defender died with a hole in his brain. They are orderly, professional, a warrior species, Shaya thought, and that thought stayed with him for the next 3 months as he watched the shipyards produce more and more and more, until they had 50 ships to the humans' 1. By then, however, the human strategy was clear. Collector after collector had been captured, and they were forming a ring around the core worlds of Yadiax, cutting off supplies from outlying mining stations. If they want to win, though, they have to attack, which means they'll face us in our strongest position, complete with starbase support and our entire armada. Once we defeat their fleet, we can reclaim the lost ground. And so the stars twinkled on. The entire population of the core 3 worlds of their home system were devoted wholly to preparing to defeat the aliens. Without our subject peoples, the labor is harder, but we are the Yadiaxa. We will not fall. He vowed and wondered idly, what are they doing with the primitives we conquered before their coming? The loss of slave labor and scientific test subjects had hurt, but he continued to think of it as a mere temporary thing. He and all his high command were breathing hard as they sat in council with the Caxa on the day the last outer collector was reported to have been captured. We have prepared as best we can. Our fleet is stationed directly at the hyperlane entry. They can come from no other place. As soon as they do, they will be swarmed. The Admiral explained, and the Caxa's wings fluttered. We have the best weapons we can create, the best ships, and our crack crews are trained and ready to fight. Admiral Shaya, you have performed your duty well. When the time comes, you are authorized to act unilaterally in the reclaiming of our systems and in the negotiations of peace with the invaders. Destroy the human fleet, then take it all back. So says the Caxa, she declared, and his wings fluttered with involuntary release of joy at her faith in him. His council of high officers were clearly full of envy. Their tongues all stiffened in place as he replied to her, I accept your Radiance's orders and will not fail you. It was such an unprecedented honor that in spite of the state of things, Admiral Shaya thought of himself as happy. When the humans arrive, we will show them why we have never lost a war before. He vowed and waited for word of their coming. It was 3 lunar cycles before he realized something with absolute horror. They're not coming. The Yadiaxa fleet was the strongest it had ever been, but their entire strategy had hinged on one thing, that the humans would attack. It's just common sense, of course they'll attack. They have to. How else do they expect to win if they don't? He asked, as he stared dumbly at the screen. Each of the trio of worlds were structured solely around the construction and maintenance of ships. Even their starbase had been modified to ensure the maximum number of ships could be maintained. The Terran fleet had not changed much, with only a handful of large battleship signals showing as having come to reinforce the one identified as Admiral Yamamoto. In addition, the solar collector there had been expanded into a support base with a shocking degree of speed, and according to the signals, it had a number of weapons platforms to augment the human armada's fighting force. Thus bottled up, Shaya undertook an unusual stratagem, taunting. The face of the human admiral appeared on his screen when their connections linked up. "I did not know you were so afraid of us. Perhaps you would care to surrender now and save the lives of your soldiers?" Shaya said without wasting time on pleasantries. "Perhaps," Admiral Yamamoto replied. "I will consider your request and reply within 3 of your lunar cycles." The transmission was then cut. Shaya could hardly believe it. Are they cowards after all? He wondered, and sought to consult with the only one who was in his estimation wiser than himself. "Agreed. It is a strange thing. But they are aliens," the Kaksa answered. Her confused fluttering was as much relief as worry in the Admiral's mind. "Perhaps such surrender practices are common. We know little of these creatures beyond that they are hardy survivors." And so they waited. 3 cycles passed by again, and the human Admiral's transmission came in on the very last day since his initial request. "Do you submit, or do we fight?" Shaya asked. "Nuts," Yamamoto answered, and the transmission died again the same as before. What exactly that meant consumed ample thought and ample time, but when there was no movement of the human fleet, one thing Shaya was sure of: the humans simply weren't coming, and this time he didn't need to go to the Kaksa. She summoned him. "Are we under siege?" the Kaksa asked him directly. "I believe this is what they call it. They show no signs of moving to attack us. It makes no sense. What do they wait for? Are they building more ships?" he asked. It didn't seem likely. Such massive ships had to have a high cost. Perhaps they are fighting somewhere else. There were only 2 certain things. The humans weren't coming, and the system could not support any more ships. It was 2 more lunar cycles before the Kaksa called him into her private chamber. Her wings drooped, her tongue was limp, her body was drooping as badly as her wings, and the Admiral's horror seemed to have no impact on her demeanor, as if she didn't even register it. "We are beaten," she said at once, and Shaya's tongue went so stiff he couldn't vibrate a word. The Kaksa didn't need his question to know what it was. She put the answer on screen. It was their economic forecast for the next 3 cycles. "Our materials all go to the fleet. Our soldiers produce nothing, but they must train and eat every day. Our ships must be maintained, and materials spent on that are not spent on our infrastructure. We have been cutting corners expecting a decisive battle that could turn this all around, but you can cut only so much from the top before there is nothing left to cut. Our hospitals are not able to care for the sick. Our citizens are growing weary, suicides are up, the cocooning is down. To meet food demands, we used chemical growth acceleration, but the soil is growing weary. We had to pull 3 ships from the fleet to hover over the most depressed cities to keep order. Soon we will have to pull more. Our front will weaken." She inhaled deeply and exhaled hard. "How is the maintenance of the fleet?" Forced by her question to say something, Shaya spoke the truth. "Suffering. We have been on constant alert since the last collector was taken. Even crack troops become sloppy when kept on such hours for long enough. Mistakes are up by 48%. Half of those destroyed intact spare parts. It won't be long before we reach total economic collapse. The fleet cannot be maintained, and our scientific research has been underfunded. We can no longer hope to upgrade our fleet, even if we had a breakthrough. We cannot afford to create or install new equipment. This was their strategy, leaving us to destroy ourselves. Can we not at least send out what we have? If we gamble it all on one fight, if we can destroy their fleet here, then we can still reclaim all that was lost. Your Radiance." Shaya all but begged, but he could see his words had little impact. "Would you in their position have been idle this whole time?" she asked, and his tongue stiffened in dismay. "She's right. Even if they equipped only modest weapons of their sort on our captured arrays, Our swarms will be diminished in every battle until we are beaten, and surely they will have reinforcements on the way before we've taken even the second one. And that assumes we survived the first fight with a still intact swarm. Shaya's mind reeled at the implications. I will do it myself, the Kaksa said, slid the pad across to him so he could initiate contact with the Terran. Admiral Jonathan Yamamoto's face remained unchanged from their last interaction. Admiral, the human said, to what do I owe the pleasure? Shaya couldn't bring himself to leave it to the Kaksa herself, so he spoke in her place. We are beaten. Name your terms, invader. Shaya said, his pleading eyes cast up to the Kaksa. Her head hung in the second defeat of her life. She fluttered her wings to tell him to continue. We want what we wanted 7 years ago. Payment for the lives lost to compensate the families and the government for the destroyed ship. An official apology for your unprovoked aggression, and a treaty of peaceful non-aggression to ensure this does not happen again, and the ones responsible for the attack must be handed over to us. If we do this, your fleet goes back, and you return our taken territories, Shaya asked. The fleet will be diminished, but a defense force will be kept docked at the base where we are now stationed, and we will return nothing. That is the price of war. Do you accept? The human's steely eyes seemed to peer into Shaya's soul. The admiral of the Yadiaksa felt his wings droop. We do. We are sorry that we began our contact with you by aggression. We accept the fault for this war, and will repay you as you ask. But I must say, to be beaten this way, I never foresaw. He stopped speaking when the human admiral nodded. Our people learned a few things long ago that were instrumental in our triumph today. 1. Who knows when to fight and when not to fight, need not fear the result of 100 battles. 2. That fighting without fighting yields the greatest victories. 3. That you should never interrupt an enemy when he is making a mistake. I will send a formal treaty to you within the hour, Jonathan Yamamoto said, stood up and leaned forward toward the screen. You may be tempted to violate it when my fleet here is diminished in number, but I promise you, we are prepared to sign the next treaty on your homeworld in person with whatever remnants of your government survive our next retaliation. We abide, Shaya answered. His eye went to the Kaksa, whose drooped wings and downcast air told him she had no intention of even trying for revenge today, or any time soon. I'm sure you do, Jonathan said, and the transmission died as surely as the hope Shaya had for the future. With the transmission dead, the screen showed the map of Yadiaksa territory. Only the core worlds remained. The Empire was reduced to a state it had not been since they first set out into the stars to settle, explore, and conquer. They don't even need to spend vast sums on star bases to keep us confined. We can't afford to raise a large enough armada to be a threat, not anymore. Our fleet will have to be dismantled down to a fraction of what it once was, or our whole society will collapse in on itself. What of us will survive if we turn on one another? There was no good answer there. What will become of us now, Your Radiance? Shaya asked of their ruler. As you said, we abide. Perhaps someone will overthrow them, and we can rise again. And if not, we must do our best to survive in the shadow of man. Else we die in their coming flames. And I do not wish to lead us into the flames a second time. Her words were different than they ever had been in all the years of knowing her. And as such, they rang true to him even where another would find them difficult to accept. Recall the fleet. His treaty has arrived already. We must make the best of this. Whatever that means, even I know not anymore. She gave the order, and his drooped wings as he signaled his obedience, and went to carry out her will, wondering himself what would rise after the twilight of the Yadiaksa Empire. The Kaksak watched the riot unfold on the screen, wings battered and ripped. Her riot police brought down the peasants who flew wildly about in the sky, smashing into buildings, looting, burning. The torn silk of wings floated down to the ground with the grace of dying leaves, and the shouts and screams of all sides became an unintelligible cacophony of horrors and complaints. Worse, over half the rioters couldn't even riot properly because they were badly underfed. The flames spread from building to building, and emergency services, what were left of them, struggled to respond. A blast of energy raked the ground below, no doubt fired by one of the hovering military vessels meant to keep order. Effective months ago, familiarity had given birth to contempt, and now their power had to be demonstrated on the people it had once been meant to protect. Is this how the Idiaxa fall? By our own mad, desperate claws? She wondered, and not for the first time since the defeat of her people by the Terrans, she questioned the wisdom people always insisted she held. She shifted to another terminal, and the same picture was shown with different faces. I knew scrapping the fleet wouldn't do enough, she thought, and tapped the emergency comm channel. It hadn't been used since the human armada under Admiral John Yamamoto had appeared on the border of the hyperlane and threatened an invasion that would never come. At least I have a backup plan, she thought, and recalled the projections that showed widespread hunger was inevitable within 5 years without strict rationing, and was inevitable within 7 years even with it. To compensate for this horror, she'd done all she could. Strict egg control meant few new offspring would need food. Special professions such as scientists and laborers in vital industries were given priority, and even a selective termination program of the elderly had been put into place. That program even included an incentive program that would give 1/3 of the rations to the survivors of those elders who voluntarily ended their lives. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, then months into years, the weary population began to grow angry. The well-fed were despised, especially by those with lower priority offspring. If only they would heed their kaksak. Within 10 years we would begin to recover. But if they riot and destroy, it may take 20, 30, or perhaps we never recover. The reason for that last thought was on yet another screen, showing rampaging citizens tearing over one of the flower farms, tearing up the crops to consume with no chance of replanting. Such selfish actions would provide immediate relief, but everyone responsible was almost certainly going to die. The military police who caught up with the civilian vehicles carrying raiders began firing, and it wasn't long before fires began to spread, and gunfire was returned against the military. The farm was going to die in fire, and all the supplies that it would have provided would either be consumed in one go, or they would be outright destroyed. I have no choice. I cannot risk the destruction of our people, she thought. And as the system-wide communication network finished readying itself, she spoke. Her face appeared on every channel. Her words went out over every audio network and line, both public and private, every handcom and every station, all at once. I, your kaksak for the whole of my life, address you, my people, all of you, and tell you that I have heard your cries. I tell you truly, one and all, that I undertook only what was necessary to protect the whole and keep us independent. But I see I overestimated what you could endure. This is no fault of your own sometimes. Anyone can be asked to bear too much. The fault, if it lies anywhere, lies with me for my failure to deliver victory over our enemies. Therefore I will undertake one desperate measure that will save all your lives. It is a measure no kaksak has ever undertaken before in all our history. I will be marked by shame through all the eons to come, but it will save you. I, however, have one price. 3 months of peace, 3 months with no riots, and if you deliver this price, then I will ensure you are delivered food and goods needed for survival, and end the blockade that has choked us slowly until we reached our current state. To all authorities from local to planetary, I order you to cease any attempt at arresting any rioter after the peace comes. And I further order that any arrested figure is to be released within 7 days of this message reaching your offices. This is the end of an era that ended in error, and what begins with it? I can only hope it is better than what came before. She then tapped the rapid comm line that connected her to the nearest human citadel on the nearest system. She didn't wait long for an answer. This is Admiral John Yamamoto. The human's face was on screen an instant later. I will make this brief, the kaksak said. My people are dying. The Idiaxa are dying. I wish to save my species. And? The Admiral said in a deadpan voice. Why are you telling me that? We are beaten, human. Did I not admit it? Must you humiliate us further? She asked, and the human shifted a little. It was a rare movement from the stony figure, and one she intended to capitalize upon. In her study of the people who surrounded her own, It seemed they had particular codes of behavior, and the humiliation of a defeated figure was counted as a shameful act. I offer myself, Admiral of Mankind. I submit myself to your people for arrest, trial, and if need be, execution for the war and for the destruction of the friendship. I ask only one thing in return. Feed my planet and help us to rebuild. I will appoint a successor to carry on as a governor, instructing him to abide by your empire's laws and obey it as a subject people. The Kaksak's words hung in the air, and she saw the eyes of the human grow wide. I will arrange a transport today, and more will follow weekly until order is restored. The Admiral bowed his head in a rare show of respect as he gave his answer, and the Kaksak imitated it as best she could. I will be on the return trip. Do with me as you will afterward, she said, and cut the transmission so she could summon Admiral Shaya and appoint him as the new Kaksak and military governor. She glanced at the screen. The riots were slowing and dying, and all that remained for her was to wait. In the aftermath of her offer to the humans, the rising empire of man felt a shockwave of differing emotions. Some danced with glee, celebrating in the streets that the once feared butchers were now broken down to their souls. Others took a more measured approach and began considering how to take advantage of the situation. But the government's response was to abide by the promise of Admiral Yamamoto, arranging convoys of food, medicine, and other vital supplies to the broken worlds of their former enemies. One widespread sentiment was an unexpected rush of positive emotion. A politician who trades their life for their people. Maybe they're not all bad. Maybe it really was just a fear-driven overreaction. Sentiments of that sort were more common than one might have expected. And within a 3-month time, the former ruler of the defeated Idiaxa Empire was brought to Earth, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment. And the blockade came down. Idiaxa merchants began to take to the stars using refitted military vessels, and shipments of supplies began to speed the reconstruction of the broken system. Human soldiers kept order in the streets by partnering with local security officers, and under Shaya's strict military leadership, order was maintained step by step until life could be restored to normal. Less a few differences. There were no shipyards capable of building military vessels in the Idiaxa system, and military forces were restricted to 1 soldier for every 10,000 civilians. And with that, the different colored spot on the stellar map that showed Idiaxa territory vanished into the Terran blue. There's a lesson here, President Lawrence said to his cabinet as they went over the previous year's events. His steel-gray eyes matched his firm-seated posture in their severity, and he did not wait for his colleagues to ask him what that was. Instead, he told them, "A strong fleet is vital in securing our exploratory vessels. We should make a habit of keeping a battleship in every sector to defend starbases and act as reinforcements for explorers. We must never let what happened to the friendship happen again." The rest of the staff nodded along. What's more, we now know that first contact is likely to be a messy business. According to the eggheads who have been working on translating those other transmissions, the signals came with advanced energy signatures. That usually means weapon systems. When we go out to meet them, we need to go with guns enough to tell the others we're strong enough to defend ourselves. It was so practical a set of suggestions that 2 policies were put into place that month. The militia doctrine, which set a battleship in every occupied system, required that all surrounding systems were responsible for mutual aid. This meant it was possible for any system under threat to muster up a fleet of 3 to 5 ships to defend their borders, or fall back to other systems to create serious fleets of 10 or more ships for quick engagements. The other doctrine was simply the Lawrence Doctrine, or more commonly known as the Law Doctrine. This policy stated that every science vessel attempting to explore unknown territory should be accompanied by 1 vessel to defend it or buy it time to escape. In the days that followed, language after language was translated enough to make first contact remotely via transmission, and the science vessels that reached out to new neighbors did so with Peacemaker-class battleships right behind them. A clear universal signal that while the humans weren't going to initiate violence, they were not going to suffer it to be done to them either. and there were no shots fired as one by one the borders of expanding empires were found, and informal peace was established with the understanding that both sides were armed. Humanity, however, did not forget the lesson learned with the friendship incident. The militia and law doctrines remained in effect when the transmission came in from something never before seen. "We just can't find a world for them," Dr. Coleman said with exasperation as he slumped in his seat. His arms were limp and dangled wearily against the outside of the chair's armrests. "Our ships have searched everywhere, and if they ever had one, I can't find it. Nobody can find it." "I know. That's why I've brought them up. Our language experts have a translation for you, and we're going to need to know how best to respond to this," President Taylor said and glanced idly at the portrait of his predecessor, President Lawrence, the author of the doctrines that had been protecting mankind for the last 10 years of continued growth and expansion. "I don't know how I'm going to fill his shoes, but there's no choice but to try," he thought, and tapped the screen to send over the guttural language of the spindly, plant-like creatures with subtitles written below. "We are the sacred dark, warriors of the Mother Void. We abandoned the cradle to grow strong, and now we sail the void to slaughter heathens in the name of her glory. You cradle dwellers who cling to soil are meant only for death, but we may be persuaded by sacrifice to turn our armadas against your enemies. Tribute us when our ritual tells us to guide our ships toward you, and we will have peace for the sacred cycles. Refuse, and our ships will burn the surface of your worlds. We will harvest your goods and your people, and you will know better on our second coming." The transmission ended, and President Taylor inhaled deeply. They have no world because they left it behind. Their fleets are massive and their technology is nearly on par with our own. Our only real advantage is that we can replace our numbers easier than they can. But because they're nomads, there's no real center to hit them at. Even if we defeat them, they'll just slink away outside of our space. And then what? They come back later when they've rebuilt? This is a problem. The militia doctrine was meant to ward off minor incursions by small fleets and to act as a deterrent, not to fend off a mobile civilization of religious fanatics. Dr. Coleman sucked in his breath at the staggering implications. "Doctor, tell me you have something," the president almost begged. "Even if we win, we'll lose half the damn fleet fending them off, and we now have more neighbor states than we ever imagined possible. They'd surely take advantage of any weaknesses and slice off pieces of our territory. And if one does it, the others might too, and we might end up in a war for survival that makes the Ediaxa War look like a skirmish." The possibilities were beyond horrific in the president's mind, but before they could go too wild, Dr. Coleman spoke. "We do, actually. Two somethings, actually. They're only theoretical concept designs right now, but with the right funding." He shrugged as if to say, "It's up to you." "What kind of designs, Doctor?" the president asked the old man. As the lead scientist and engineer, Dr. Coleman had served as the scientific advisor to 30 years' worth of presidents. His designs included the first deep space science ships that could function with a crew indefinitely, as well as the warship designs that had eventually avenged the Friendship. With his retirement coming on quickly, both he and the president had expected a quiet transition to private life, only to see this. And for his last hurrah, Dr. Coleman did not disappoint. "I call this one the Titan class. It's 6 times the size of a battleship, and it requires so much power to operate that only our latest engine designs can serve it. Maintenance is expensive, but it's worth any 12 battleships. The other, I call the Juggernaut class. It takes 2 of our latest engine designs, is twice the size of the Titan class, but it has one advantage that makes it all worthwhile." The doctor smiled with wicked intensity, and the president leaned in toward the screen. "Yes?" he asked with breathless hope and the sort of intense stare that had intimidated his political opponents into silence more than once. "It's a mobile shipyard. We can make anything up to battleship class with it, specifically 2 at a time. It also serves as a repair station for any ships damaged in battle, so damaged vessels no longer have to take the long routes back to Sol for repairs. It means we can fight on the run and even replace lost vessels or expand the fleet on the go. Just building this one should serve as a warning to other empires that Earth is not to be trifled with, not to mention give us an edge over nomadic fleets of raiders. I'll have the funding bill before the Senate tonight. You just tell me what I need to ask for. I'll handle the rest. The president's no-nonsense approach was cause for relief in the mind of the aging scientist, and he bowed his head politely. Humanity will never suffer the fate of the friendship. Not ever again. The doctor said with quiet reverence, and closed his eyes as he recalled the faces and names of those he knew, whose tattered and scorched flesh still drifted endlessly through space. We will make sure of it, the president said, and signed off to prepare for whatever tomorrow brought. We could just hire them to raid our neighbors, the Minister of Finance said. He was a wiry man with ink-stained fingers and owl-like eyes, whose skin was entirely too pale and whose body was entirely too thin. His left eye twitched with nervousness in his seat between the Minister of Education and the Minister of Health. It could be useful to have a large armada of allies destabilizing our rivals. That's fair, the Minister of Education said evenly. She was a thickly built woman with bright silver hair and keen, small brown eyes. She sat primly in the manner of a 19th-century schoolteacher, and her severe dress, black and form-fitting, accentuated her still vigorous frame. If the Minister of Finance seemed nervous, she seemed more like a stone wall. Despite her reasonable tone, it was obvious to President Taylor that she had an opinion and that she had no intention of giving ground on it. However, if history has taught us anything, it is that mercenaries are inherently unreliable, disloyal, and a problem to have around. Worse, these are religious zealots. It's not a question of will they turn on us, but when. Agreed, the Minister of Health added. As with all of our science vessels, we take samples of biological material to ensure that it is safe to come into contact with. On one of those missions, the sample was from a people that had been raided by these sacred darks, or whatever they call themselves. They were suffering from persistent illnesses caused by biological warfare. That was 50 years ago. I know they're aliens, but the truth is they don't think anything of the most taboo forms of warfare. According to the report that went with the sample, the population only survived at all because they turned over 10% of their population as a slave labor force. We're working on vaccines against the Sacred Dark's favorite biological weapons, but that could take years. I don't think we can just pay them to go elsewhere, at least not for long. Likewise agreed. The Minister of War, an aging John Yamamoto, nodded along. They're strong, and that means that their raids have enriched them, not weakened them. If we send them off to fight and they come back stronger, the price of peace will become ever greater, until they decide it's worth more to just burn us off of our worlds as heathens. And we can't have that. I support the project. The other ministers were similarly in agreement, and as the lone dissenter, the Minister of Finance bowed to the majority and expressed his support. Thus united, President Taylor presented a budgetary proposal which was signed off on by his entire advisory staff, a thing which hadn't happened since the Idiaxa War. However, there was one additional piece of funding: the heavy arming of the border starbase to a full-blown citadel, complete with a full complement of armaments and the lion's share of the Terran fleet. Faced with the gravity of the situation, the Senate ratified the Earth Defense Bill given the name Pinckney. Within hours after President Taylor vowed that there was no controversial legislation in it to be found. Free of the pork of unrelated allocations, and reassured by the promise of one of the few politicians not regarded by his colleagues as a liar, it was the fastest bill to be ratified in the last 200 years. $1 billion for defense, but not one credit for tribute. President Taylor said as he signed off on the bill mere minutes after the Senate vote. And with that, it was done. And then the work had begun. Plans were routed to factories responsible for creating the precision parts. Work crews were expanded, both human and Idiaxa. In the aftermath of their defeat, faced by the grim reality that rebuilding their shattered economy would take decades, a few million of the Idiaxa people moved off-world and settled in various human colonies, taking jobs in factories and learning how to serve their new overlords, only to find, shockingly, that they were granted citizenship and allowed to participate in local elections. Only those at first, but after 10 years' residency on their new homes, they were permitted to vote in planetary elections, and within a few years of that, they would be permitted to vote in empire-wide elections for the presidency itself. The xenotolerance policy of Earth began to prove popular, and without even noticing it, the aliens began to assimilate into their new lives among their former enemies. Not wholly without prejudice, but it was better than they'd hoped for. As such, almost as if they felt the need to prove themselves, Ediaxa engineers worked even harder than their human counterparts to bring the vision of the Titan and Juggernaut vessels to fruition. Day after day, year after year, the tension grew. The Sacred Dark had its own wiki page filled with the reports of their horrific raids. A full list of planets that had been glassed by nuclear fire, of populations ravaged by biological warfare, and worse. It appeared that they were able to easily overcome their targets, threaten important systems, and receive tributes to stay away. With this new enemy, and with the Ediaxa acting clearly on the side of humanity, those prejudices began to fade away, being replaced by a new one. One made worse by an extremeness that even the Ediaxa had never shown. 4 years after it began, the Titan slipped out of dry dock for its first run, and 4 years after that, the Juggernaut followed and began making ships on its own, while in flight, promising reinforcement and repair to any and all fleets it could join. Faced with the newly displayed strength of the growing Terran Empire, factions within other empires began to reach out in the hopes of borrowing their strength. President Taylor, now 8.5 years into his 10-year presidency, stared at the transmission. "We are the Kana Liberation Front. We have been enslaved by the Intakana Confederation. We intend to rebel against our masters and are ready to declare our independence. We would be grateful if you could lend us your aid. Support us in our rebellion. Help us to be as free as your people are, I pray to you." Problems on top of problems. The president thought. "If you're asking for military intervention, I can't promise you that. I can't drag my people into a war on someone else's behalf. However, you may consider our borders to be a safe harbor. No people of Earth will ever deny a slave their freedom." It was an open-ended dismissal, but it had the intended effect on the Kana. The spindly, frail-looking alien had a long, snout-like mouth that bounced back and forth in front of his face as he spoke, and fingers twice as long as a human. In his case, one hand was wrapped around a rifle of the Terran Empire. Going to war is one thing. Smuggling weapons to dissidents is another. Besides, it wouldn't hurt us to have a state as naturally opposed to us as that, made a little bit weaker. We'll allocate some defensive funding to weapons that can find their way into the Kana's hands. That and upgrading our starbases along the border, just to remind the Intakana Confederation to steer clear of us. The president pondered that policy and recalled the Kaksak, the still imprisoned former leader of the Ediaxa Empire. If anything goes wrong with this, the buck stops with me one way or the other. He vowed privately. Her surrender did a great deal to win over humanity, so much so that, as Admiral Yamamoto put it, if our first contact had gone differently, they might have become our closest allies. In the next 2 months that followed, President Taylor watched the distant star bases grow and improve their armaments, adding more defensive platforms, listening devices to catch any military movement that might go unnoticed, and that caught the word of the rebellion. 1/4 of the Intakana Confederation population broke away, seized ships, and declared their independence, demanding the space they now occupied be recognized as an independent nation, and demanding the return of all their still enslaved people on other worlds. President Taylor winced. They went too far. If they'd just declared that zone independent, they might have managed to negotiate something with a few victories. But they're 1/4 the size of their oppressor and don't have nearly the means to take what they're demanding. Never demand things you're not strong enough to take. He shook his head. It was fairly guaranteed that the Confederation would fight a bitter war against their former slaves to make an example out of them. The transmissions he watched were digital recreations of ship types, numbers, and strategies for both sides, and it left him pitying the rebellion. As the war raged on, humanity stood and watched. The news televised it nightly, providing daily updates on the conflict. The Intakana were a cousin species to the Kana. The civilizations had risen and fallen repeatedly over the ages, and as the two divided biologically, so they also divided socially, with the resource-rich Intakana repeatedly invading, occupying, and enslaving the offshoot as an inferior breed. The hate ran deep in the Kana, and with enough strength to rebel, they acted, and died, because while they had the strength to rebel, they had not the strength to win, or win by much, with victory costing them as severely as defeat. "Free the slaves" became a popular rallying cry from human lips, and though President Taylor's administration quietly smuggled resources to the oppressed population, it was not enough. "We have said, never again after every time it's happened. When will we actually mean it? What good is power if it does not provide liberty?" Senator Brown shouted into the microphone, his face red with outrage as he raged on. "Yes, we've cut off trade relations with the Intakana Confederation, but that's obviously not enough. We should intervene directly. We could end the war in a year or less if we just sent one of our mighty fleets within to the aid of those who share our spirit and love of freedom." President Taylor sat watching the man speak in the little corner of the screen, while the majority of the monitor was dominated by the video of a Confederation warship raining fire down on the helpless Kana city. He's not wrong, but... The president glanced at the calendar. The Sacred Black were coming up on the time of their sacrifice ritual, to determine whose borders they would raid or demand tribute from. "We can't have our fleets away at a time like this." He thought, and shook his head. His perceived inaction against the Intakana Confederation at least couldn't hurt him in the next election, since he was allotted only a single 10-year term. But even so, it would hurt his party. If a radical like Senator John Brown is elected, he'll drag us into a war one way or the other, and if he does that before we deal with the Sacred Black, we could lose a dozen worlds before we can even put up a proper fight. It was enough to make him pray that they chose the Terran Empire for their target now, rather than 5 or 6 years later. Not a month later, the transmission reached Earth's outer colonies. "The Sacred Black has chosen you for the cleansing. If you do not give up 2.5 billion of your people, and an equivalent quantity in minerals, power relay access, goods, and other resources, our fleets will raid your lands and ravage your people. We will take your defiance for war, and we will see what making a fight of it buys for you." When President Taylor received the transmission, along with the rest of the Empire, there was only one answer to be given. "If you want so much from us, come and take it." He shot up 40% in the polls, on the same day that the Sacred Black crossed the border not in the stellar north, but in the stellar south, after taking the long route with a small fleet through Intakana Confederation territory, outside the reach of any censors. I think it's safe to say their choice to raid us was not motivated by ritual alone, at least based on the path of invasion. The president thought, and within minutes after the first Terran starbase on the border was destroyed, he had John Yamamoto in his office. "Well, what do you say, John? How do we handle that invasion? I never imagined they'd come by that route, and now it's only a matter of time before they start bombing our worlds and seizing our citizens." President Taylor's voice held its usual calm, but if he was as cool as ice, Yamamoto was as cold as the black void that was so beloved of the sacred dark. "Me neither. I have to hand it to them. But they're expecting us to weaken our northern border by sending out a fleet to crush the invasion that will make us weaker in the stellar north, and the bulk of their armada is still right there. It is safe to say they'll then launch a second invasion from the north and catch us on both sides." He folded his hands together behind his back and said, "I think the best way to deal with this is head-on. The stellar south is sparsely populated. There are a lot of weak targets there, but they're low value. The people in those regions can hide and take cover. We might lose a few million, but if we rush to try to save them, we'll lose billions. I say we invade the systems on our northern border. The bulk of their outposts are there, and the vast majority of their fleet. If we crush them in one big battle and shatter their outposts, we can then turn south and defeat the smaller force there. For all their power, they put all their eggs in one basket, and we can make them howl for that in one go, if we win." "And if we don't?" the president asked with a furrowed, troubled brow. then we'll still have made them feel like they lost, and we should be able to cripple them for decades. Their southern raiders will still cause a lot of damage, but they'll be weaker with every success until they have to pull back. I admit, it's a risk, but I'll go myself and make sure it works." President Taylor wanted to object, but he couldn't find the words, so he nodded. "Godspeed, Admiral." "Godspeed, Mr. President." The Admiral snapped off a crisp salute across his wrinkled, graying brow and killed the transmission. With the decision now made, all the President could do was wait for what tomorrow might bring. Admiral John Yamamoto took his place on the bridge of the Juggernaut-class vessel, the starship Prometheus, and after seating himself he said, "Engage," and the fleet leapt to warp. It was the largest assembly of ships in the history of the Terran Empire. 80 battleships, a Titan, a Juggernaut, 6 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 2 frigates that had been in service since before Earth even had a single colony to its name. Compared to the armada of 8 ships that had brought the Ediaxa Empire to its knees, the difference was night and day. But on the other side of the hyperlane lay the Sacred Dark's armadas, backed by a powerful citadel. It was the lion's share of their resources. According to intel, they have 99 vessels of varying strengths, but that citadel is strong enough to blow a hole through a goddamn planet, or so they say. It was an unpleasant thought, probably more a bluff than anything, and not the type of battle he liked. In the Ediaxa War, he'd been able to utilize keen strategy and cripple the enemy to break them without a real fight. Now he was forced to take an enormous gamble that they could wreak havoc on the fleet, their strongest citadel, and hopefully still have enough power to destroy the other 4 outposts of the Sacred Dark that they depended upon for security. Shift cycle after shift cycle at hyperwarp, Admiral Yamamoto alternated between days of drill and days of rest, driving his people hard to prepare them for the coming fight. His one comfort? There's no way they'll actually expect us to invade, so we should get the first shots off. He held on to that thought a great deal, right up until the moment they emerged into the Balelus system, and the vast armadas of the Sacred Dark sprung into view. "Fire!" He shouted the command across the fleet communications, and the torpedoes of the humans launched from hundreds of ports, racing over the space between the 2 forces while the Sacred Dark scrambled to come about and respond. Lightning shots ripped across the void, followed by bright white plasma and penetrating javelins. Guns began to open up as the distance closed. Shields flared on both sides as the fight began to spread out on a broad front. A human battleship ignited as the weapons of the Citadel locked in on that one vessel, as if to say, "Fuck you in particular." Fire lit up the dark for a moment, as the crew of 600 all died at once. But the casualties were not only with mankind. Battleships of the Sacred Dark began to erupt as well. "Titan, target their Citadel! If we can blow that to Kingdom Come, they might retreat." That had its appeal. Forcing a withdrawal would buy time for reinforcements, repair, and they could fight a running series of engagements to wear the Sacred Dark down through attrition at their own speed. The Titan hammered the Citadel, the shields flaring with every blast until they began to collapse. The Sacred Dark's vessels began to reform, shielding the Citadel with their ships as if they too were armor, moving only to let the stationary target fire again and destroy another human warship. The fact that they lived their whole lives in space and learned to use them from birth gave the wiggly aliens a distinct advantage, rotating their ships to ensure the strongest shield was always in the way. Even when it meant temporarily disabling their weapons, they began to exact a deadly toll. 2 more ships exploded in the night, weakening the human fleet, followed by a third when a Sacred Dark ship moved aside to allow a blast of energy to strike a cruiser and end the lives of a crew of 300. A moment of grim inspiration struck the Admiral as the toll of victory was made clear. "Ramming speed!" Admiral Yamamoto ordered. "Target their center. Open fire with everything you have on their left wing. Let's see how brave the Sacred Dark is when they have a Juggernaut bearing down on them." "Sir," the helm replied, and the engines flared behind the ship as power was increased, and the speed of the Juggernaut tripled. It didn't hit the Sacred Dark right away as to just what the human admiral was doing, but it did not take long. With their ships arrayed in a line, they had moved only up or down to allow a clean shot from their citadel, and that meant that veering out of the way to the left or right was impossible. They scrambled, breaking formation, sometimes just a little too late, and added their death flames to the night, defying the darkness they so loved in their final moments of life. The Prometheus continued its forward momentum, and the other captains rushed their ships into the gap, focusing their fire on the left wing just as their admiral had done, forcing more scrambling by the Sacred Dark as they tried to reform a cohesive defensive front. As the stronger close-range weapons came into use, the shields of the Citadel died completely, and the Prometheus became the default target, only to find that the Terrans were no less brave and rushed their ships in behind the capital ship to absorb fire for it, just as the Sacred Dark had done for their starbase. The ramming speed of the Prometheus did not slow down until the unstoppable force met the immovable object. Admiral Yamamoto held the smile on his face until the burning heat destroyed his flesh in one single painless moment of smug satisfaction. "Job well done," he thought at his final moment. Fire erupted in 1,000 places, and it seemed to both sides as if time had stopped. Whatever the Sacred Dark expected to protect themselves from, a suicide run was not on the list. The Terran Armada opened fire again. Their rear ships quickly formed a line that outflanked the remaining Sacred Dark vessels. Though the Terran Armada had been reduced by 20, the loss of the Citadel and the crippling of a number of Sacred Dark vessels, not to mention the collapse of their line, had turned the tide. Taking fire from two sides, the Sacred Dark ships began to light up, and their attempt at reforming into a third defensive line saw those withdrawing ships hit in the rear, and this time, thanks to the heavy fire, when their shields gave out, their engines quickly followed. The Sacred Dark Armada underwent a collapse. From its beginnings at over 99 vessels, they were now losing a ship almost every minute and growing. The Terran Empire's ships continued the encirclement, as there were ever fewer left to be encircled. Until the last ship burst into its death nova in the darkness. "This is Captain Sarah Pike of the Titan-class vessel Red Dawn. I am assuming command of the Armada. Undertake recovery operations for damaged vessels and send over a crew to salvage the Prometheus. We have 2 weeks to repair before we move on. With this battle, we have won the war, but only if we do not waste it. They will rebuild, unless we leave them nothing to rebuild with." "Sir." The captains of the other ships powered down their weapons and began to reorganize. A third of the Armada was now dead or disabled, while the Sacred Dark had suffered a loss of 100%, and it would take them months to build anything back, if they even had the resources to do so. There was still work to be done, but the lingering doubts about the outcome, those were as dead as the ships of the Sacred Dark. Acting Admiral Sarah Pike brought the Prometheus up on screen. A surprising amount of the vessel was intact, a testament to the quality of its armor, but she had no doubt that Admiral Yamamoto was gone. The dead center hit had crippled the bridge and done God knew how much damage to the interior. Absent its compartmentalized design and state-of-the-art auto-power rerouting system, it would have been destroyed. "Why did he sacrifice himself like that?" she asked, but she knew the answer before she finished asking. He knew. He knew he wasn't going to live many more years, that this was his last fight, and he didn't want anyone under his command to die if he could prevent it. If he hadn't taken out the Citadel, we could have lost half the fleet, or even lost the battle entirely. Whatever it takes, it takes. She thought with reverence as the weight of his sacrifice and that of his bridge crew. He must have known they wouldn't survive either. Etched itself onto her soul for the rest of her life. She stood and snapped a salute to the dead. Her dark fingers trembled a little as the magnitude of the day began to hit home for her. Nor was she alone. "We still have a job to do," she told herself, and began to pull up scanning data for the next target, even while recovery vessels shot out of the large ships of war to save or salvage who or what they could. There would be time to mourn later, time to think later. For now there was only work, the work of war. The repair of the Prometheus was going to take much more than 2 weeks, however, much to Acting Admiral Sarah Pike's relief. Its repair bays on the wings were almost completely intact. With the use of a mobile dry dock and the survival of the vast majority of its engineers and technicians, the battleships were able to dock 2 at a time and be repaired in short order. Some were so lightly damaged they could be repaired in hours, while others would take days, and others weeks, even with parts scavenged from those that were beyond repair. News of the victory was already sent back to Earth, along with the news of the death of Admiral Yamamoto, but Sarah didn't care to linger over news reports. What were we so scared of? Was not a refrain she wanted to hear from idiots so far behind the lines they had no real understanding of the cost that had been undertaken to make their victory not just real, but overwhelming. Especially not while there was a much smaller but largely intact Sacred Dark Armada ravaging the southern territory near the border of the Inta Kana Confederacy. A fact that wasn't lost on her any more than it was lost on anyone else with any sense. It was with that understanding in mind that, after the 2-week repair period passed, she ordered the acting captain of the Prometheus to take the Juggernaut south. Continue its repairs, and use its mobile dry docks to build support ships as you go. Travel south and defeat their last armada. I will handle things here, and we should both be done with our work within a few weeks of each other. Her amber eyes were bright and energetic, and the red dawn was abuzz with activity. Ma'am, the young captain, previously a lieutenant who received a field promotion as the only surviving member of the bridge crew, rendered a salute which she crisply returned. Good luck, she said. I won't need it. He vowed with confidence. His smile might once have been boyish, but the burn marks and shrapnel scars that now coated his face would never let it be that way again. The quick-acting medical staff had at least managed to return him to duty, but he would not win any beauty contests ever again. He didn't seem to mind, and the ship began to peel away from the group, returning through the hyperlane the way they'd come. It was a quiet departure, and out of respect, Sarah gave her crew one more day of rest, enough time to watch the ship disappear completely and to recover mentally before they set out. The following day, the dark-skinned woman seated herself in the chair on her bridge and said, "Engage," launching the fleet toward the next hyperlane that would carry her and the 54 ships under her toward the next Sacred Dark stronghold. It was no battle that awaited her. It was a mop-up. The starbase on site was a stationary target whose only motion was rotation. Its only support were 2 cruiser-sized vessels and 2 frigates. Worse, the star it harvested energy from was prone to flares, so the base had to reroute abundant power to shields, thus making it durable, but depriving it of weapon capability beyond its platforms and a handful of guns, torpedoes, and missile bays. "Spread out, surround them, and take them down," Admiral Pike ordered, and the long line of ships spread out, leaving no cluster of targets to be aimed at as a group, before closing in and surrounding the station. Raked from fire in every direction, the shields of the Sacred Dark did not hold long. The little ships that tried to augment the power of the station were so outgunned that their destruction was more perfunctory than anything else. Within an hour, the station was destroyed, and its guns fell silent without having taken down a single Terran ship. "Move on. We'll repair on the way. There's no reason to give them time to even build a frigate to face us at the next place." Her order was met with the slow maneuver of the Armada toward the next hyperlane. So it went. The next battle saw only a single frigate to support the starbase, and the final one, not even that. No more Terran ships died in the darkness. "Send word to the capital. Have them send out the science ships and construction vessels to start settling the worlds here. Just because the Sacred Dark didn't want them, doesn't mean we don't." Far to the south, Captain Armin Nelson watched 2 battleships launch from dry dock. They were 5 hyperlanes from where the last Sacred Dark Armada was bombarding a Terran planet. 100,000 humans were dead, and 4 starbases were in flames behind invading fleet. I wonder if they know they've lost yet. He contemplated the question, but he doubted they did. How could they, when there were no survivors to tell them? The clang of metal could not travel through space, but watching the glorious sight of their mobile manufacturing was plenty to let the captain's imagination run wild. The smell of oil, the stink of grease, the roar of engines so loud that they couldn't be fired up from the dock itself. Rather, they came online as the Prometheus slipped away from them after releasing their magnetic locks. Those were not the first 2 ships to be finished on the long journey south. The 2 new ships fell into formation with the others, 6 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 8 frigates. I'm still outnumbered, but that will change. Captain Nelson thought and twitched his nose. Even the imaginary smells of oil and grease were enough to remind him of his days working with his father's garage and repair shop. No sooner than they were in line, the manufacturing of 2 more battleships began. Their construction continued between the gravitational disturbances of stars, which broke up the hyperlanes and slowed travel considerably, and it continued while the ship was under warp along the thick space lines. Until finally they reached the outskirts of the hyperlane and were ready to go to warp, and Captain Nelson brought his fleet to a stop. "Give me the latest readout on the fleet of the Sacred Dark and the planet they're bombarding. What do we know?" he asked. His chest felt tight as he watched the bombardment from above. The computer at once began to speak in its robotic voice. "The world has 9 million inhabitants. It's a young colony. Over 1/4 of them are now missing. We believe 1 million have been killed, and the others captured and put into cryostorage to be transported back to what was their space for processing and sale as slaves throughout those states which still keep to the practice. The 20 ships that are currently in orbit are inferior to our own. However, the Prometheus is still not fully repaired, and their numbers are greater than ours. We may be defeated without more ships. Should we delay our departure?" the computer advisor asked. "How many on the planet will die if we wait until victory is easy?" the captain asked, and the computer quickly answered. "They're able to kill an estimated 10,000 per day, and capture twice that. It will take 30 days more for additional ships to be constructed. We can expect them to kill 300 to 400,000 more in that time, with twice as many captured. We won't wait. Transmit orders to all ships." He gave the order, and in the dark of night, engines at rest flared to life. "Minimal manning until arrival. Only do simulations in the morning, then relax for the day. I want everybody prepped and ready for battle mentally and physically." His order, having been received, was promptly carried out. The days at high warp went quickly, and before he or anyone else knew it, they appeared to grind to a screeching halt as they left the faster-than-light pathway and raced toward the world being bombarded by the last armada of the Sacred Black. Whatever the scoundrels were, they were not cowards. Their ships wheeled around to face the Terrans and came out firing. Blasts of rockets, torpedoes, phasers, neutron beams, and arc-light lightning crossed the distance, and shields were battered back and forth. They dove and wove like birds of prey, avoiding and dodging, spinning and weaving, trying to get an edge over the supermassive juggernaut and the fleet which spread out around it. The frigates blew in tiny flares, killing the crew of 6 in both vessels and scattering their components into a surprisingly stable orbit around a nearby asteroid of substantial size. The Prometheus's cannons finally pierced a Sacred Black battleship, and it erupted into an almost supernova-like light before the dark consumed the space again. The ship shook, and a rainbow of lights from various forms of energy, all contrived by the races across the void for the purposes of slaying those they never knew, for reasons few would ever understand, raced back and forth. The outcome, if it was not foreordained, was quickly becoming certain. The Prometheus acted as a barricade, tanking the blasts of the smaller vessels and acting as a point of maneuver for the small task force to work around. And never once did the Sacred Dark ship surrender. Not even when there was only 1 ship left against 12. "Brave. They were very brave," Captain Nelson said as the quiet began to reign again. "I can hardly believe it. I knew it would come down to one battle to destroy that armada, but I just didn't realize how quickly it would end once that happened." President Taylor said in his office as his colleagues sat around. His sentiment was shared by others in his cabinet. Indeed, the entire war had only lasted as long as it did, because the raiding force that crossed into Terran space did so on the southern frontier via a previously unknown wormhole, and it took almost a full year to properly respond. But in both cases, north and south, only a single real battle was needed to end the entire conflict. Still, there were casualties. Gods above and below, there were casualties. the president thought as the casualty list scrolled over the screen. Over 10,000 military personnel, and according to the final tally after driving off the Sacred Dark Raiders, over 2 million dead civilians. Not to mention the destroyed and looted property, and of course there were the missing flotillas of captives that had warped out just before Captain Nelson had arrived. Concerns piled upon concerns all over again, and President Taylor felt like a man twice his age when he stood at the podium to speak to the Empire. They came to kill us. They came to make us slaves. Now they are driven from our borders. They were strong. They thought they were invincible. They thought wrong. We are now stronger than ever, and we will not forget the lessons learned out here. Danger lurks beyond every border. Peace is temporary, and strength is the difference between millions dead, millions more enslaved, or life and liberty for all of us. We will not forget, nor will we allow our descendants to forget, that our honored dead left us the legacy of that lesson. We will grow stronger. We will defend ourselves from any threat from any corner, and what happened to us will never happen again. President Taylor shouted the last 3 words and pounded his fist upon the podium, cracking it down the middle with his genetically enhanced strength. And from world to world, system to system, base to base, and ship to ship, the throats of mankind opened up to release a shout of defiance that threatened to violate the laws of the universe and send their voices sailing through the void of space where no sound could pass. The months that followed the president's speech saw a myriad of changes. The funeral of Admiral John Yamamoto resulted in the erection of a towering monument known as simply the Defiance of Man. It showed him standing erect, leveling his pointed hand forward with a steel look in his eyes, 1 foot back, 1 forward, and urging his ship forward. The few surviving members of the Sacred Black, mainly small family groups on lightly armed transport vessels, surrendered and abandoned their long-held faith after believing that the deep void had given up on them at last. They were settled in small numbers on border colonies that sprang up on what was once their territory. And Acting Admiral Sarah Pike was confirmed in her place as head of the fleet, while Captain Armin Nelson was confirmed in his role as the captain of the Prometheus for his swift action and courage under fire in the rescue of the besieged colony world. The Kana rebellion was slaughtered despite outside aid, and their survivors were enslaved again under the Inta-Kana Confederacy, while the recorded atrocities against the defeated peoples stirred both the fears and the sympathies of the Terran Empire. And Senator John Brown's fiery rhetoric included the following: the raiders had to pass through somewhere, and where else could it be but with a people as brutal as the Sacred Black? And why did the raiders come for us? Could they not have been paid by the Intakana? Why put anything past a slaver, especially if doing so would get them more slaves? Where might our captive people be? And thus his popularity grew, raging against the Intakana, stoking the idea that they were involved in the brief war, and that the lost people of planet Hamlin may have found themselves enslaved deep within the heart of the Confederacy. His popularity grew as time passed, and the Terran Empire began to look outward, not at what friends lay beyond the farthest star just waiting to be met, but at what dangers there might be, and what price they might pay if they were unprepared for the unknown tomorrows. And the fleets began to grow at home and abroad.
I swear to defend the freedom, the law, and the lives of the Terran Republic, no matter the danger, no matter the cost, no matter whether they be but one alone or 1 billion strong. President John Brown said, standing there with his wild dark hair blowing in the gentle breeze as he was sworn in by his predecessor, President Taylor. It was a rainy day in the city of Louisville, the capital city first of Earth, then of an empire which now encompassed 50 systems and 35 worlds, the combined total of which included over 90 billion Terrans and then another 9 billion aliens, including the entire conquered species of what was once the Idiaxa Empire, which totaled 7 billion out of that number. The remaining 2 billion was made up mostly of alien refugees, Kana liberation escapees, former slaves whose failed rebellion was televised across their sector of the galaxy. The last 30 million of the Sacred Dark were the only remnants of their once powerful nomadic species. And then there were others who were drawn to the principles of the Terran Republic's representative government, not to mention the security of the Terran fleet, which had suffered only one significant defeat in the last 40 years, after a small fleet wandered unknowingly into the territory of the Sacred Dark. The spirit of the day was positive. The recent victory over the nomads and their resettlement on the surface of yet undeveloped worlds had eased the fears of mankind that horror was around the corner. Though the memorials that were dedicated to the dead of the bombarded world were somber places, especially to the survivors, the election of Senator John Brown to the presidency was a statement of Terran sentiments that, above all, their liberty must be secured. A sentiment that was redoubled with the understanding that their other neighbors included 2 slave states, a dictatorial religious theocracy, a military dictatorship, and a slew of border worlds where former soldiers had turned into rampaging mercenaries. We are the one bastion of liberty in the galaxy so far, though who knows about those peoples we have not seen. We must protect ourselves from the external threats our neighbors pose. President Brown thought as he left the ceremony. The rain was just starting to come down, and when the band began to play him off, a Marine attempted to hold an umbrella over his head, only for the president to wave it off. "No, a leader doesn't stay dry while his followers are made wet. Call for my car, I have a republic to run," he added, and spent the next few minutes meeting and greeting while he waited for the vehicle to arrive. Most people referred to the Terran Republic as simply the Terran Empire, particularly after the subjugation of the Ediaxa territory. But John refused to ever refer to it except by its official name, and when a reporter approached him to ask, "Now that you're president, how will you ensure that the Terran Empire is secure in the way you promised?" John turned his head away from the reporter and spat on the ground in disgust. "We are a republic first and foremost. No matter how large we become, no matter how many wars we win, no matter how many peoples fall under our flag, republic we were, republic we are, republic I will ensure we remain. That is the first way I will secure our people." Spitting in the street whenever he heard the word empire had initially made his reputation, and at first many considered it to be mere grandstanding. But over his 20-year career in public office, the wild-eyed man with the equally wild dark hair had never once wavered in his commitment or his habits. Notably, he authored and sponsored the Xeno Equality Bill, ensuring aliens within the Republic were allowed equal rights under the law, and establishing a grievance board that let them petition for swift court hearings and mixed jury selection to include at least 1/4 aliens of the petitioning species would hear the case. On suggestion that the Ediaxa, as a conquered people whose government had warred against mankind, should be specifically exempted from these protections, John Brown stood at his podium in silence for 68 continuous hours until he collapsed in his own stink and the motion for that condition's inclusion was withdrawn. To say he was popular with aliens and controversial with humans was to say that there was a fair amount of water on Earth. In that spirit, he elaborated upon his answer. "The second way I will secure our people is to ensure that those citizens of ours who travel are accorded proper security against injustice. I will propose migration treaties that provide for the freedom of movement between our peoples, which will include conditions of prosecution, which will hold our respective courts accountable for the trial of our own citizens." As President Brown's vehicle rolled up to where he stood, and his driver stopped to open the door for him, the president took a slow breath. As he was half in and half out of the vehicle, he added one more thing. "And of course, in addition, I have not forgotten our lost people, the ones taken by the Sacred Black. It is true that they may have died in space en route to nowhere, but if they didn't, they will be found and they will be returned home, even if it must come to war to make that happen." With that, the door closed and the car rolled away. Praxa Jean of the Intakana rewatched the interview of the human president again. It was the 4th time watching the human's speech, and it still sent a shiver through the Praxa's body. "Do you think he means it?" he asked of the priest of Ko. "Who can say what the slave races mean or do not mean, save the gods themselves?" High Priest Laxa Jean replied. "What does it matter, brother? Mean it? Do not mean it? We are the Intakana Imperium. We are bound to the Bavragan mercenaries, the divine Lamra with their 12 fleets, and the Catharian mandate. Even if they find that their lost colonists ended up here, which is unlikely since they are deep, deep in the interior working alongside the Kana slaves to replace those we lost. Would they really be daft enough to fight a coalition such as ours? They funded the Kana, Praxajan replied succinctly and spread open his arms. What fool would give arms to a slave race? Who can say what they would do? Nothing so foolish, not after seeing what we did to the Kana who were captured under arms. Laxajan shivered with amusement. It is but an empty bluster. Remember when the Kana leadership promised to burn our homeworld if we did not let their people go? What happened in the end? They burned only themselves. Praxajan hummed in thought. It made sense. We will be cautious anyway. No transporting any human slaves away from frontier worlds far, far from their borders. Death for any human caught with a communication device, and no sale of humans off their existing worlds. That should be enough, shouldn't it? Laxajan asked with a twitch of his antennae. I think so, the Praxa replied as comfort settled in upon his soul. Two can keep a secret, if both of them are dead. That expression ran through President Brown's mind many times as the days of his administration went on, and peace reigned for the first year, the second, and the third. Trade was profitable, and the neighbors of the Terran Republic sought ever closer bonds of friendship. With most, President Brown was enthusiastic as if they were already old friends. But with the Intakana, the Bavragan mercenaries, the Divine Lamra with their expansive armada, and the Catharian mandate, his answer was always the same. He stood at the podium and told the whole of the Republic, "Who a man calls friend tells you who he is. Humanity must be a friend only to those who will let all others live freely. We cannot befriend the slaver, or we say that the slaver's choice is as good as ours. We must stand on principle or we stand for nothing at all." He pounded his fist upon the podium, his wrath and anger lit by the outrage in his soul as he recalled the slaughter of the freedom fighters of the Kana Liberation Front. 3 years after their flotillas of survivors escaped into Terran space, they were now well entrenched on a dozen or so worlds, most of them deep behind the border out of fear that their masters might come to reclaim them again. The stories they spread of their lives of bondage kept public opinion with the president, despite special interests arguing that the economic benefit of trading with the Intakana outweighed the morality of refusing to do so. This quiet dislike of the slaver states might have remained just that, except for a certain event. Admiral Pike looked on the view screen in front of her. "What am I looking at, Major?" she asked, while the oblong metal tube continued to rocket onward toward seemingly nothing. "Ma'am, it appears to be a Bavragan mercenary escape tube. They modify torpedoes with propulsion and cryogenic life support systems, and then set out a beacon signal meant to pick up friendly or at least neutral forces and then activate. It's pretty clever, really. But he's a long way from home." The Major glanced up at the mocha face of his admiral. Her lips were pursed as she thought over her options. Her amber eyes, intense in their focus, revealed nothing of her doubtful thoughts. "We're not at war with them, but if this is a criminal, rescuing him might be a problem. According to Terran law, those sentenced to death must be given asylum on a seed world. That means we can't give him back, and there is a fleet of 500 ships across the border that will probably take issue with that. Better to blow this thing apart and pretend we saw nothing." The pragmatic answer was resting comfortably on the tip of her tongue, waiting for her lips to part and give it the chance to be made known to her bridge crew. But she said nothing. "On the other hand, we're obligated to rescue everyone in distress. The self-doctrine demands that we do as we would want done for us." She inhaled and exhaled audibly for several seconds before she abandoned pragmatism and said, "Tractor him in. Let's see who this is and we'll go from there." It wasn't lost on her that half the bridge sucked in their teeth at the compassionate decision. Nobody wanted to fight the Bavragan unless they had overwhelming force, and having overwhelming force meant having at least triple what the Terran Border Patrol now had. She stood up while the glowing blue beam drew the escape bod closer to her ship. "I'm going to meet with our guest. Major, you have the bridge." She didn't wait for any acknowledgement of her order before she left. Her feet clicked and clanked over the metal floor of the Red Dawn. but she heard nothing. A sixth sense had overtaken her mind, something akin to what she felt in the flow of battle, the way she could almost feel the tide turn and know the outcome was foreordained as if by fate itself. The little pod held promise. Who knows what? But I feel like every step is carrying me through the path of history itself. Fuck. I hope it's peaceful. She prayed to the god she'd given up 20 years earlier. Each deck she passed through to the cargo hold redoubled the chills that went down her spine. It should have been nothing but a routine rescue, one made only slightly odd by the trajectory on which the pod was found and the nature of its origins. But her intuition told her it was more. When she reached the cargo bay, a medic was on hand and already working on the cryoreduction process that would safely awaken the passenger. "Is he alive?" she asked, a twinge of shame going through her when she found herself hoping he wasn't. "He is, ma'am, and he'll be awake momentarily," the young medic said, and Admiral Pike held back her frown while she looked at the long-necked alien. He was wearing their military clothing. That much was unsurprising. The vast majority of the Bavragan were enrolled in their military forces, which they then regularly leased to various neighboring states to fight in their wars, even when it meant fighting each other. The eyes, two squares on a blank face, fluttered open. "Welcome to the Terran starship, Red Dawn," Admiral Pike said, and the blank black eyes fluttered again. "Human," he said, and the flaps that lined his body twitched with relief. "I made it. I live. I request political asylum." "Political asylum?" the Admiral asked when she heard the unexpected request. "Yes. I am Captain Lorca Exor, formerly of the Ventress clan, now last of the Ventress clan. My clan is gone, who is not dead, is now among our killers as the fodder ones." His face flaps fluttered in what she vaguely recalled passed for sorrow, and Susan gave him a moment to compose himself before she asked, "Slow down. That's a big ask. I know you must have been through a great deal just to get here, but I can't grant political asylum just on say-so alone, not without extenuating circumstances." She replied to him and set her hands on her hips. "If I did that, every scrap between your clans would send more people our way." His blank pink face flaps opened and closed a few times in rapid succession while he sat up as the cryoreduction continued. "What if I can offer the Terran government something it desires greatly?" Captain Lorca's voice was definitely alien, but even across species, she could detect the note of opportunism in his tone. "I'm listening," she said with a tentative and doubtful expression to match her equally dubious tone. "I can tell you who has your missing people and where they now live as slaves." The captain's answer was enough to freeze both Susan and the medic in place. "Asylum," the Admiral said, "is granted. Tell me everything." "As you wish, Admiral," he replied and rose slowly to begin the final phase of his escape and the next phase of his life in exile. President John Brown listened intently, his hands folded into a pyramid on his desk as the hollow transmission of Admiral Pike went on. The faint green light was animated as she went on and on, relaying the story told to her by the mercenary she'd rescued. The flotilla learned of the fall of their last stronghold in the stellar north months before their arrival, and instead of fighting a losing war or risking prosecution for the enslavement of Republic citizens, they turned stellar west to the Intakana and their satellite states, sold their captives deep behind the border, and now live like the kings and queens of old. Slave prices are very high there since so many of the Kana died in their rebellion, according to the mercenary. They put humans in explosive collars and use them as domestic servants as well as farm or industrial labor. He says they're even considering cloning humans as a new slave species and are considering the genocide of the Kana. "Would they really do that?" the president asked with a furrowed brow. His blood was racing in his veins as he worked overtime in his head to bottle up his outrage. "I don't believe that last part, not with the Terran Republic right on the border. But if we lost a war and were crippled, maybe then? I believe it's something the Intakana would plan for. I've had enough dealings with them in my patrols, and you can just feel it in the way they look at you, like they're thinking, how much could I get for you in credits or labor?" Admiral Pike shuddered. "What are your orders, Mr. President?" Her back went stiff as she contemplated the order she already knew was coming. "Maneuver your fleet to the stellar west. Await further orders on the border." He gave the order with the crispness of an experienced commander. Despite having never served in the military, it sounded to her ears like a man used to being followed, and she snapped off a salute before he disconnected the transmission. President Brown hit the button for the subspace communication relay that would connect to every ship in the fleet and every general's personal line. "This is President Brown. All military vessels are ordered to the following positions on the borders of the Intakana Confederacy, the Sankat Amalgam, the Dros Mercantile Alliance, and the Bavragan Mercenary Alliance. Report your ETAs as soon as they are known. Planetary officers are ordered to raise armies of xenomorphs and gene warriors for the course of the next year. Saul Drydock, you are to begin commissioning 40 new battleships. Border system governments, you will begin expanding your energy collecting stations into citadels equipped with the maximum number of weapon platforms and armaments of war, in addition to enough anchorages to support an expanded fleet. Are there any questions?" Why?" The question came from 1,000 voices who could scarcely believe such a radical order was real. The president finally lost his temper, with outrage erupting from his lips when his body could no longer contain it. "Because we know where our lost people are. We're going to go get them. And we're going to show this entire galaxy why nobody enslaves a Terran." He rose to his feet and smashed the visual icon with his fist so that every single person could see his wild-eyed and outraged expression. "There is no such thing as a slaver who deserves to live. They will give back our people, and we will free the Kana along the way, and the many worlds will know. You do not fuck with Terran freedom." He seethed as the words slipped through his teeth with the slow, burning deliberation of a snake slithering out of its lair as he restored to himself some semblance of reserved dignity. But his eyes did not so much as blink. He stared into the very souls of those who watched him and burned away any doubt that he meant every single word. Praxajan looked at the transmission from the Terran Republic. It wasn't one done in person, a serious insult to the dignity of his office. It was only a recording. But insult or not, that did not stop him from replaying the message. "Give them back! Give them back! Give them back!" President John Brown's hair was wild, his face intense. There was no threat of war, and worse, there was no offer of payment. It was just a single looped demand. "I suppose the threat of war is implied." Praxa pondered as he searched the alien face for any hint of the state of mind behind the mask of angry expression. Praxa was not idle. As the transmission replayed for the 9th time, he had already summoned Laxajan and the other council members set to advise him in the proper course of action. But practical concerns aside, he couldn't help but be annoyed at the less than pragmatic approach. "They could at least offer to buy our property back," he grumbled as the hiss of the door announced the entry of his cabinet. "That is unlikely," Rorona Jean said, having heard the quiet annoyance of his cousin. "Praxa, you don't know the humans as I do. They are a wildly different people than we. Yes, it would be easier and cheaper to just buy back the slaves we purchased from the last flotilla of the Sacred Dark, but not all humans are as practical as we are. They are closer to the Kana, passionate, emotional, and they have curious principles that trump all reason in their minds." Laxajan's slender frame and long arms became stiff at what was near blasphemous disagreement from his cousin. "Rorona, you are questioning the master of our race." "No, I am doing my job and advising our cousin Laxa. I opposed the purchase of Terran slaves before, and I now advocate for their swift and unconditional return. The human race is alien, unpredictable, and as we know from what happened to the Sacred Dark and the Idiaxa, they are dangerous. They waged a 7-year war with the Idiaxa Empire over the loss of one ship and a handful of scientists. And that, I remind you, ended with their ruler living in a Terran prison in exile, and their homeworld being the first expansion of what is now their empire." Rorona's 4 eyes blinked out of sync with one another in a show of distress, and his mouth briefly closed to let the rest of the council take his words into account. The implication was clear. If we fight, it might be our homeworld next. Worse, In the mind of Laxajan, he had a point. Is it more practical to simply return the captives, then? To declare it a misunderstanding and perhaps pay restitution to the slaves, Praxa suggested, breaking the quiet stalemate. Yes, if we intend to repeat that act with the Kana, or the captives of the Sacred Dark, or any of the other slaves we have purchased over the years, if we simply give them back, what will the other states do? We may lose all of our labor force if we give in, and then where will we be? Iksajan, the Minister of Labor, protested at once. His snout trembled, his fat body jiggled as he flopped into his place in the small circle. Where will we be if we are defeated in a war? The Kana might rise up all over again, and the next time they might be strong enough to win. Rorona ventured, but before he could say more, Laxa shouted out, "Blasphemy!" Now who is being emotional and impractical, cousin? Rorona asked without missing a beat. Even with the gifts of the divine ascended Ko, we are not gods ourselves. We can die, and a Kana with a good blaster can kill any of us here, just as well as a Ko-built death stick can kill a rebellious slave. If our fleets are shattered, our hyperlanes blockaded, and our shipyards occupied, we will collapse. The Kana were badly mauled in their rebellion, but they are still the vast majority on many worlds that feed our empire. Without our fleet to hold them down, they need only do nothing, and if we cannot send armies and cargo ships, we will starve on a dozen worlds within 3 months. We will appeal to the ascended Ko, Laxajan exclaimed, and even Praxajan said nothing for a moment. They are the ones who gifted us with the means to reach the stars, to build an empire of our own, and their fleets are stronger than anything in the Terran Empire. If we, their worshippers, are threatened, they will aid us. Praxajan mulled that over in silence. In theory, the Zo were gods who guided the fate of the Intakana Confederacy and gifted them space travel as well as intelligence. In practice, he knew the reality, that the ascended Zo were a stagnant remnant of a once mighty ancient empire. Whatever had occurred to cause their collapse, it traumatized them so much that their society never expanded beyond its current borders again, and relied on overwhelming technological superiority to bully younger races into compliance with their whims. But then, there was that damn fleet. Laxa was right. It far surpasses anything the Terran Empire has, and they have always been willing to aid their worshippers if we make a sufficient offering. That settled it. Between the coalition of the Intakana Confederation and its allies, and the gods of their religion which held the population in stupefied awe, the weight of President John Brown's short message steadily diminished. Rorona, if the Zo assist us, can we win? Praxajan inquired. Roronajan was the least faithful of the Confederacy, one of the few who didn't really believe that the Zo were the gods they presented themselves as. Praxa tolerated his cousin's less than faithful view for 3 reasons. The first was that he was a relative. The second was that he kept his blasphemous attitude confined to the small cabinet meetings. And the last was that his hard-nosed, fact-based approach was vital. He could always be relied upon for sound advice. If they intervene right away? Rorona asked the rhetorical question and then answered it himself. Then we will win. Our coalition will be able to strike along a broad front, and the Zo are well positioned to strike in concert with the Bavragan mercenaries. But if they do not intervene at once? Rorona chewed on his tongue as he ran the quiet calculations through his mind. We will almost certainly lose, and if we do not, then victory will destroy us just as badly. We will send an offering at once, and then I will send a reply to the ape president, Praxa said as he settled in on his decision. What will you tell them, cousin? Rorona asked. A faint sense of dread at the possibility of war settled into his gut. President Brown sat at his desk and watched as the translation of the Intakana leader's words ran. Their language was complex to the point of insanity, and so it took several minutes for even the simplest of phrases to convert into any Terran tongue. When it did, President Brown's face darkened with rage. If that's how you want it, John thought, and went to check on the movements of the fleet before summoning his press secretary. The entire Terran Republic would hear the message of the Intakana Confederation's response to the demand that they return Terran slaves to their homeland. It would play on a looping news cycle for dissection, and then one day play in history classes where academics would dissect the simple response over and over again, until everyone grew sick of the theories about what was really meant by the words, "Come and get them." Admiral Susan Pike watched the little flotilla of treasure ships as they exited the hyperspace lane. Just as intelligence reported, the Inta were sending a tribute to the Ascended Co. in the hopes of receiving their aid in the brewing war. And just as intelligence reported, along with the trajectory planning AI of the Terran monitoring stations, they would pass through an uninhabited system on the Co border. "Wait until they pass by the sun, then blow them to kingdom come," she ordered. The suns of the various solar systems of the galaxy wrought havoc on hyperlane drives from the most primitive to the most advanced, and while the lanes themselves compressed years of travel to a few weeks, it took as much as a month to go from one hyperlane to the next, without emergency actions that were not guaranteed to work. It meant that the Red Dawn had an easy opportunity for their ambush. The long ships of the Inta Confederation were not without their escorts, but it was more an honor guard than anything else. The white sun glowed in its timeless way, burning bright in the night. A gas giant older than the Earth continued its orbit. The orange and red hues were swirling in patterns that were beautiful from a distance. But up close? Even the Red Dawn would be ripped to shreds if it were caught in the storm those patterns represent. According to the science office, those storms will die one day and are shrinking in intensity by 1% every million years or so. I wonder if it will be as beautiful then, or if we'll still be around to study what's left of it. She shook her head. It was a trivial concern made even more trivial by way of the impossibility of knowing the answer, and she redirected her focus to the more immediate issue. The Titan-class Red Dawn remained still, with minimal power going for weeks to hide it in the signal noise of the white dwarf star, and now, the proof of their enemies attempting to bribe the ancient and arrogant Co. into supporting them, there was only one mission. Stop them. "Make ready," Susan whispered as if the convoy of ships could have heard her if she raised her voice even a little bit more. "Don't do it," the tiny voice in her head whispered to her. It was one thing to take life during war, to slay soldiers, warriors, those who volunteered or entered into conflict with an awareness of their actions. Even when the odds were stacked against one side or the other, that was just strategy, tactics, and both sides were trying to get the upper hand as soon as possible. But this was not war, and almost none of these were soldiers. Even those who were, they were an honor guard equipped for ceremony and not for combat. "It's not war, it's murder," her conscience told her. "Begin powering up weapons, minimal power to engines." The Admiral's order was met with a flurry of activity, and in the reflective monitor she could see similar battles being waged across the faces of the Terran crew. "Turn back, please, turn back, change your minds, go home, you fools! You're going to spark a war! Just give our people back!" She folded her hands behind her back to hide the wringing of her hands as she willed the flotilla to obey her and turn back, to decline to deliver their offering to the Co. "They don't know what they're doing! They can't know that billions will die if they continue on!" She heard the voice of her human spirit crying out inside her. Sweat that was not there even when engaged in battle against the sacred dark began to form on the black skin of her forehead and drip down, rounding her eye and tracing its way down her cheek. "Forward, round the perimeter and hit them as they pass. Don't let them reach the next hyperlane jump point. Lock on their engines," the Admiral said, and felt the motion of the ship beneath her feet. Thanks to the latest upgrades in inertial dampening, she knew that this feeling of lurching forward was an illusion, something created by a career full of familiar expectations when that lurch was the norm. Now it was all in her head, and the youngest officers all insisted they never felt a thing. "You're getting older, Susan," she told herself, and began counting off her breaths as they moved around the border of the sun to find the slow-moving ships of the Inta religious envoy and their honor guard of the living dead with them. "Fire," she said, and a flurry of beams and torpedoes shot out of the Red Dawn before the little flotilla could even properly grasp the danger. Their attempt to scramble was too little, too late, and 5 torpedoes hit dead center at the engines, 4 ships exploded. The remainder began to spin out wildly as the crew within tried to recover. The arc beams ripped through the unshielded engines of 2 more vessels, and all their ports went dark as power died. The arc emitter line of weapons was unique in that they didn't destroy in the usual sense. Instead, they overloaded and disrupted systems, to include backup systems. The 2 ships struck had now lost all power, and all backup power, shutting down all life support systems. The Admiral couldn't see or hear it, but she knew what was happening. The crews of both ships would have breath gases for a while at least, but inevitably the mere act of breathing would ensure they ran out of whatever passed for air. They would then exhale themselves to death until they choked in the darkness days later. Beams of plasma and phasers were kinder to 6 more ships, the honor guard of the offering vessels. They raised shields and got in the path of those ships they were meant to protect. The Admiral raised her hand in a slow salute to her deceased enemies, as the old ceremonial vessels showed that, beautiful as they were with their flowing lines and gold-inlaid patterns, they were not suitable for modern warfare. Each of them exploded in a burst of fire that died in the dark of space, and the powerful beam weapons of the Titan hit the religious ships, as if the guard vessels had not even been in the way in the first place. Brave. Foolish. But brave. Susan thought as her salute was lowered gradually back to her side. The ships they guarded were granted barely a few seconds more of life, but they became their own little suns just as their guards had a moment before. The last of the ships held on for not 5 minutes more, and then there was nothing. Nothing but the red dawn. The debris they made, and 2 ships of Intakana citizens whose agonizing deaths were now inevitable. Admiral Pike's eyes lingered on the floating fear containers that were once sacred envoys. No prisoners, no talking. Destroy the entire thing. She recalled her orders. There was no ambiguity in them. They're helpless. They've lost. They can't fight anymore. Her conscience told her. Her orders were clear. The easy thing to do would be to board and occupy them. The alternative was to just abandon them to their agonizing ends. Admiral Pike did neither. Fire on those ships, turn them into scrap, she ordered, and for a moment nothing happened. She glanced back at the weapons officer and nodded. He obeyed. Missiles soared through the night and disappeared from view. Then there was nothing to give evidence that they flew at all until the last ships of the Intakana exploded like the ones before them. You're a murderer, her conscience warned her, but the reason behind her orders came to her just as readily. The Co will probably enter the war no matter what, but if they enter when it begins, the Republic will be overwhelmed this way. We buy years of time to finish the fight and save billions of lives. The price of saving those lives is a handful of Inta ships and a lifetime of sleepless nights for one admiral. I'd call that a bargain. Admiral Pike wiped the sweat from her brow, gritted her teeth, and whispered so quietly that only she could hear her own voice. I can live with that. The tension was so thick and rich that Captain Armand Nelson of the Prometheus could have drizzled it over hot pancakes like syrup, and it wasn't so just for him alone. The whole crew of the Juggernaut-class vessel was itching to just get on with the war and end the staring contest. They were right on the border with the Intakana at the southernmost connecting tip between their empire and the space of the Terran Republic. Everybody knew beyond any doubt that the fight would begin soon. Captain Nelson had no doubt about the outcome in his mind, however. We're much stronger than the Intakana, and we have assets they do not, right behind their lines. It was enough to put a smile on his face despite the tension. Few Terran soldiers really knew how much work had gone into preparing for the battle ahead. He recalled the mission briefing before his departure to this hyperlane. The war began when the challenge was issued and was decided before our first shot was ever fired. It was only in the aftermath of the briefing, after reviewing all the many notes and trigger events that were supposed to prompt certain actions of his own, that he truly understood what that meant. And on this day, the first trumpet of doom for the Intakana Confederation rang. His comm station beeped to draw his attention. Play it out loud, for the whole ship to hear. His soft voice took on a commanding air he rarely used, and it briefly startled his aide to hear him speak that way. Her eyes shot to him from where she was previously looking, as if unsure it had actually come from him. Having confirmed the reality of her ears, she tapped the ship-wide comm channel and played the message. On this day at 3 p.m. Terran Capital Time, we of the Kana Liberation announce our rebirth and our freedom from the Intakana, their confederation, and all states to which our bodies have been sold for generations. We celebrate this day with attacks on 14 installations and 57 cities across 5 planets, and we formally request admittance into the Terran Republic as citizens. Our people are your people, and your people are our people, if you will have us. Another transmission beeped, and the stunned blonde officer looked his way a second time. Understanding dawned on her as she realized he was expecting this, and he nodded again. The transmission played for the whole ship, just as it did for every other in every Republic fleet. The Terran Republic has voted to accept the Kana Liberation citizens as members of the Republic, with all the rights and securities of any human, the freedom to travel, to work, to petition the court for redress of grievances, and to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Fingers trembled among the experienced officers who understood the implications of that declaration. The vote was too quick, and its meaning was doubtless, but for the rest of the galaxy, it carried on to clarify. As our people are being held against their will through the ancient crime of forced labor, that scourge of liberty called slavery, the Terran Republic Senate has voted unanimously for the declaration of war upon the Intakana Confederacy and all their supporters, and President John Brown has signed the declaration at this moment, 3:01 p.m. Terran Capital Time. All fleets are to engage with the enemies of liberty, secure the freedom of our people, and the freedom of all Republic citizens, no matter where they may be. The transmission died, and Captain Nelson took one brief second more of his life, letting the gravity of the moment settle in on his soul before he said, "Enter the hyperlane, and ready all weapons. We have a job to do." The ship moved gradually for a moment, and it seemed the stars, which despite expanding with the universe seemed ever so still, were going to stay as twinkling dots to his eyes, until they didn't. They became a blur as the ship went to maximum speed in an instant, propelled along the hyperlane, the guns and torpedoes and missiles and beams and all manner of destructive things born from the minds of callous researchers and patriots and dreamers all in common work, were made ready to rob nameless strangers of their lives for all eternity. It would be better for all life if there were nobody brave ever born. If evil and good were both cowards, nobody would ever take from any other, and everyone would be safe. Or failing that, if only everyone who longed to oppress were a coward, if evil created terror in the heart, then good would triumph every time and easily. But I don't get to have either of those worlds. I'm stuck with this one. On the other side of this lane is the Intakana fleet, the vast majority of their numbers, brave. Do they come in male or female or both? Or something else? Dead gods. I don't even know what they look like, and I'm going to have to slaughter them by the thousands. The captain's thoughts boggled even himself as he steeled his nerves. In a way it was worse than the fight against the sacred dark. Those had been more advanced, even if they were less numerous, against the Intakana, with the Prometheus in the lead and their greatest admiral en route to join him and probably only months away. This gave him a sense of guilt he lacked before. But then, there was no more time. The white light that blurred the screen in the glow of countless stars was gone. The black of the night sea returned, and in front of him were arrayed some 400 ships to his 70. They're outnumbered, he thought, as he shouted out loud, "Fire!" The ships of the Intakana came on bravely, and they made up for their lack of range by waiting directly at the hyperlane exit point, thus robbing Captain Nelson of the long-range advantages of his ships. Lightning and plasmic weaponry fired back and forth. Torpedoes shot off out of nowhere as a lucky AI hack destroyed a guidance system, and they shot off course to disappear into the dark, leaving the battle behind forever. I wonder if they'll still be sailing on for 1 billion years or so. Maybe they'll hit some other poor ship from a species that hasn't even evolved intelligence yet, and they'll wonder about us now. It was a stray, pointless thought that he quickly set aside. The Prometheus was a favorite target. Its size, its fame, its power to repair and build on the way, thanks to the massive atomic assembler nestled near the engine core which harvested elements that stars and supernovas cast off, or could even break down the materials of asteroids if needed, all made it a tempting and strategically significant point of attack. If my ship is destroyed, it will go a long way toward boosting the Intakana's belief in their victory. But then, our engineers thankfully understood that. He couldn't help but smirk at the thought as torpedoes and missiles exploded against the shields, while their phaser fire only glowed in futility. The shields wouldn't hold forever, but it didn't need to. His fleet spread out on the wings and began to batter the outside of the Intakana formations. The goal of the Intakana was clear. Those on the wings were trying to encircle and pound the Terran armada from all sides, while the core was meant to destroy the Juggernaut-class flagship. Die, the captain said, not of their ships or their lives, but of their hopes, and watched as the encirclement attempt became a death sentence, with the smaller ships of the Intakana exploding in fire as they spread out, weakening the wings instead of strengthening them. The battleships that made up the majority of the fleet began to sail into the gaps like birds of prey, the close-range fire causing even greater damage than it would have at range. Here and there, a battleship joined the Intakana fleet in death, going out in a blaze of glory that diminished his fleet only slightly and costing the Intakana far, far more. From 400 to 300 and 300, down to 150, and down, down, down they went. The death rate spiked as the target-rich environment became target-poor. Poor bastard. He did the best he could. Captain Nelson thought briefly as he could feel the resolve of his enemy to fight to the very last ship. Even if it bought only 1 day more of repairs for the Terran armada, he would trade the lives of himself and all his crew. Worthy enemy. He offered quiet praise as the explosions of ships became a cascade, and the flagship of the enemy fleet, which somehow survived until the final hour of its armada, came barreling forward. The last command of the opposing admiral was obvious, as all their remaining ships turned fire directly against the Prometheus. Cannons, remaining missiles, torpedoes, and beam weapons finally saw the collapse of his shields. "You glorious bastard," Captain Nelson muttered as the flagship continued forward. The shields were somehow holding, and it took a full minute to realize why. Life support is an expensive thing, energy-wise, even in the ships of the Terran Republic. It was well understood that a fleet was essentially just colonizing space by wrapping metal around it, and life support was the most important feature. From cycling oxygen to disposing of carbon dioxide, it required a lot of energy to keep everybody alive. But what if you didn't have to do that? All that energy for all systems concentrated in only 1 or 2 areas. "That mad bastard has killed his crew," Captain Nelson said in disbelief. If all he kept alive was the bridge, the shields could be, at least for a little while, on par with the most advanced ships in the Terran Empire. "Bring it down!" He shouted the order, but the handful of remaining enemy ships seemed to have imitated their admiral and flew on intercept courses, becoming shields to let that one ship through. They died at the side of their flagship and bought the precious minutes necessary for the unthinkable. For 1 brief second, the view screen of the Prometheus was dominated by the front of the long ship of the Intakana, and then there was only white flames as the ship exploded against the Prometheus, rocking the flagship of the Terran Empire so badly that on every deck, people fell and tumbled to the floor. "Damage report!" Captain Nelson shouted as his crew righted themselves, and after a brief quiet, the answer came. "Forward weapon array incapacitated. Repair bays 1 through 6 are destroyed, and shield system is offline." I wish I knew that one's name. He was on the wrong side, but he was brave, and deserves to be remembered for that, if nothing else. He was as brave as Admiral Yamamoto. Captain Nelson remarked, then added, "Seize their solar collector, and there are 2 small colonies in this system. Signal the transports to begin landing soldiers, occupy these worlds at once. Order the repair ships to get to work, and then gather 20 ships to seize the collectors in the 2 neighboring systems. We'll be moving out within 3 clock days." "Sir, is that really enough time?" his first officer asked, and to the man's surprise, Captain Nelson denied it. "No, it isn't. But this was the majority of their fleet. They were trying to buy time. If we give it to them, they'll just build another. Even if we're damaged, we can still win if we don't have to fight. Admiral Pike will be joining us with reinforcements soon. All we have to do is take down the surrounding undefended systems. We can handle that much while they are forced to scramble. I want their shipyards under Terran control before they can raise another fleet like that one. Don't you?" He raised an eyebrow, and his first officer quietly accepted the question as an obvious truth. The war, such as it was, had begun, and they now had their first victory. 9 Terran ships had paid the ultimate price, with 24 more seriously damaged. Weeks of repair would be needed, and to build 9 more ships in the Sol system would take a full year. To build them on site with the Prometheus would take 4 times that, but in one stroke, the Intakana had lost over 80% of their defense force. The remaining 20% would be scrambling to respond to both the Terran Republic and the Kana Liberation Front. "I doubt the rest of the Confederation will be all that eager after the cost of this one battle gets out." The captain pondered, and then felt himself relax, as the defenseless colonies grew larger on his screen when his ship began moving in to support the troop transports that would bring the reality of war to the very homes of the Intakana people. "Cry havoc, and let's slip the dogs of war," Admiral Pike shouted as she approached the fleet of the Makatari. It was an open transmission that went out and would definitely reach the whatever passed for the ears of the strangely fungoid species. Though she doubted it would be recognized as the line belonged to a millennia-dead human playwright, it was catchy enough that she favored its use now, and more importantly, it fit her mood. It was the first action she'd seen since the destruction of the flotilla of Intakana ships en route to the Ascended Co, and though the action had kept them out of the war, it continued to prick her conscience. Her one consolation was the promise of real action, and the Makatari were kind enough to offer that gift to her. With 300 ships to her 100, it should have been an act of madness to engage them. But for the woman born in Zambia 47 years earlier, life had been no crystal stair, and adversity had toughened her feet to bear the shards of glass and nails fate had laid in her path of ascension. Now she walked through fire. "Break! That! Line!" she ordered as she set the fleet lock to target the flagship. The Makatari were not as numerous as the Intakana, but their shields were better and their fleet faster. Her plan, her goal, in taking the circuitous path to joining up with Captain Nelson was simple. Force the Makatari to defend their own territory, threaten them and the other Confederation member states to force them to make the impossible choice between defending their homes and winning the war. I wonder if they know they can't win. She pondered the question as the flagship exploded in front of her, and she released her control over the other ship's weapon systems to allow them to individually target their own objectives. The raw intimidation of the instant destruction of their mightiest ship was bound to hurt their morale, and perhaps it clued them into the futility of resisting the onslaught of the Terran fleet, because unlike what she read of the engagement with Captain Pike and the Intakana, the formation of ships fell apart completely. The squads and even individual ships seemed to be acting of their own accord. Are they undisciplined, or do they just centralize control so much that the loss of their leadership effectively cripples them? She wasn't sure, but whatever the case, the Makatari ships were in chaos. Her vessels began to break down into coordinated squads. Wolf packs of battleships and smaller cruisers soared like raptors, targeting engines with mass fire to batter down the enemy shields and deny them their only other advantage. It was a brief battle, and one she knew was reaching the Madakari homeworld in real time thanks to their knowledge of subspace electron spin code transmission. The Madakari collective consisted of only 9 worlds, 2 of which were in their home system, but they had massive energy needs, and as such had even more solar collectors than the Intakana, which was also the reason they could muster a fleet of the sort they had. At least one such fleet. Some of the ships of the collective had engaged their emergency drives. The white glow on the rear of the little X-shaped ships was a dead giveaway. "Let them go," Susan said into the fleet communication line. "Destroy any ship that doesn't surrender or flee, but ignore the rest. They're too few to pose a threat, and we'll catch up with them anyway soon enough." It was a thin excuse. "It's mercy, though, and I kind of need to give mercy to someone right now. There's no reason to kill people who have already given up fighting," she thought, though at heart she knew what she really wanted was to atone, in some small way, for her actions months before. If the battle had distracted her, the mercy appeased her, at least a little. When the battle was over, she had suffered only 2 ships destroyed and 30 damaged enough to incapacitate them for the next few months, compared to 3/4 of the Matakari fleet suffering similar fates in deaths and damage. "Split the fleet, Alpha through Gulf, seize the collectors of the North Path, Hotel through November, the South. We'll go through the center, and we'll rendezvous with Captain Nelson in the Caspian system." The next few days, as her fleet spread out to the trio of hyperlanes that made this system important enough for the Makatari to roll the dice on defending, would prove the decision a good one. After first one jump, then another, and finally a third, all 3 systems fell with barely a shot fired, and that was when the Makatari reached out to Admiral Pike. They had no face in the usual sense, nor spoken language. Rather, they communicated through complex chemical chains that to human noses were a pungent odor, and as such they required a specially built translator to convert scent to sound and sound to scent. "What are your terms?" was the only thing they said, and they said it on a loop while awaiting her reply. Admiral Pike felt that brief moment of ease in her soul that came with the knowledge that a job had been well done. Out of all the 6-member species of the Confederation, the Makatari were the second weakest, but they were the most strategically significant in defeating the strongest. What made them weak was not their fleet or the quality of their ships, but rather they were overly amenable, an easily bullied species once they encountered someone stronger than themselves. It was almost sad. Their fleet fought as well as could be expected, but the moment they became more afraid of us than the Intakana, they were ready to fold. She thought, and it probably hadn't hurt that Terran media and historical dramas showed humans as battle-hungry warriors quite often. It was in her mind for the best, really. With their collapse, the Intakana would be cut off from any reinforcements from the smaller member states. "As long as the Ascended Co do not enter the war, we will win easily," Admiral Pike thought, not for the first time, and not likely for the last time either. She had no doubt of that. They were not the only ancient people whose time in the stars dwarfed humanity by untold millennia, but they were perilously close to the encroaching human empire, and that meant sooner or later words would be traded that would not be friendly. She wanted to keep the Matakari waiting longer, to take more systems before accepting their submission, but that threat on the back burner lingered on in her head, and so as her ship hovered over a yet-to-be-occupied Matakari colony, she answered their calls. "You will surrender your independence to the Terran Empire. Your planets will be occupied by our soldiers, and you will bend your laws to accommodate those of the Empire. This means the use of forced labor will be prohibited, not just of our people, but of any people of any species. If you refuse, after seizing your remaining solar collectors and the systems they occupy, we will begin bombardment of your remaining worlds and hunt down the last of your fleet. Surrender or destruction, one of those will happen, and it will be absolute. You choose which." She then killed the transmission and waited. It did not take long to know their choice. Praxajan twitched as he stared at the star map. The Matakari barely slowed them down. He pounded his hand down on the center of the table, his long arm retracted against his body as he continued to curse the surrendered member of the Confederation. "Our fleet suffered the same fate," Roronajan remarked to his cousin. His voice was calm, almost unnaturally so, given the disaster they'd suffered months before. He waited while that bitter pill was swallowed by his cousins, and then added, "We are rebuilding, but so are they. We send another tribute to the Zo. Something must have happened to the one we paid before." "The gods," Laxajan corrected him, His body shook with outrage as he spoke. "And it is not a tribute. It is an offering. Do not disrespect the gods." His rage was genuine enough that he was already sweating purple blood. But Rorona was untroubled. Laxa's devout nature was well understood now, though he didn't share it. "Call it what you want, but we need their ships and we need them soon. The Matakari falling only compounds our problems, and we don't have the ships or the soldiers to deal with both the Terran Empire and the Kana Liberation Front. Even the human slaves are now up in arms. We're being overrun." He emphasized, "The rest of the Confederacy will fall within 4 months unless we get some serious muscle on our side." Praxa Jean accepted the implied criticism well enough. Stressed and angry as he felt still, the practical Rorona kept him grounded with a focused and precise assessment of the problem. "We will send another offering to our gods, but until they come to our aid, we will also send payment to the Bavragan mercenaries. Their fleets are numerous, and should pull some pressure from our lines, at least enough to rebuild our fleet and reclaim lost territory. We will make them chase our fleet. We may not be able to defeat them, but if we can exhaust them, well, what kind of a mad people would fight for years over a handful of slaves? They will give up, and we will restore what was lost, and then some, after the Ascended Co. have humbled them." It felt to all three of them at that moment as if the meeting had ended on a high note. President John Brown glared with rage at the transmission. 1 million humans and another million robots are missing after a Bavragan mercenary incursion. The local militia fleet of 6 battleships which assembled to fend them off was destroyed to the last man. They sent this notification to us. "You should have given in to our demands when they were made, humans. As we told you before, we will always collect payment. If not in credits and resources, then in blood and plunder. 2, we have not forgotten that you played host to the defeated fool. You will pay for that too. We will always be paid what we are owed. Do not forget that." President Brown's knuckles turned white. His wild, fanatical eyes stared on, a silent curse flowing from the depths of his soul at the outrage. And that outrage was boiling in his guts. It boiled and heated until it erupted in a shout of fury. "Remember? Oh yes, I will remember. We will remember. I will never forget, and you will be paid what you are owed." The one problem with fighting the Bavragan wasn't that they were like the sacred dark of years prior. It wasn't even that they were not the crazed religious fanatics, but were instead pragmatic and callous exploiters of opportunity, and so would do whatever was in their interests. No, the problem was their location. Seated on the border of the Terran Republic and the Ascended Co., they lived in a no-man's land. They had amassed a fortune in protection money from various states, and such was their military renown that they drew aspiring pirates from all social corners, even from species that the Republic had yet to identify. To attack their territory was to rile the Ascended Co., and that was something John did not want to do. Still, the war is going well, he thought, and flipped on the TRN, Terran Republic News, to see what they were reporting on. On screen, tens of thousands of people were cheering, crying, screaming with glee, and the target of their affections? The waving figures on parade. The first group of human slaves had made it home, liberated after a ground operation deep inside Intakana space, along with a handful of slaves sent back when the Matakari surrendered. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The cry of the former captives was shouted until voices were hoarse, and tearful reunions were filmed for posterity. Husbands and wives embraced, children clung to newly returned parents, and in a cynical fashion, the newscaster remarked on an opinion poll that showed his approval rating at 95%. President Brown snorted. "I only serve 1 term. I don't care what the poll says. I'm just doing my job. What a way to ruin a moment like that." Still, he enjoyed the reunions vicariously and called up the latest reports on the conflict. The Julian surrender would be breaking news soon. They occupied only 1 system, but to the average citizen, it was yet another member of the Confederacy collapsing completely. Only the smarter people would note that they were so insignificant. Their resistance was a mere token one, and they'd been dragged into the Confederation as a choice between that and enslavement. By comparison, They'll enjoy being citizens of the Republic once they understand what that means. The president thought to himself and began mentally preparing for his speech. The entry of the Bavragan into the war would be a shock to most people, but what was important was not what happened, but rather how people saw it. To that end, President Brown kept the volume low and kept an ear half open to the news while he waited for the inevitable report. I'll need to make a statement, something to set the tone for what lies ahead. His mind raced ahead on a single track of thought, barreling forward faster than a ship down a hyperlane. It came to the only answer, just as the first report filtered in on the screen. He turned an eye toward it to watch the reporter, a young woman no doubt in her 20s, her eyes horrified at what she was saying, tell the Republic what he already knew. The thousands dead, the missing, the shattered militia fleet. John got up from behind his desk and went to stand on the holopad in his office. There he waited until the request reached him for commentary. Before he answered, he scrolled through the list of comments and the trend of social communications. Are we supposed to fight everybody? How could this happen? Can we really just keep going like this? Fear was a common sentiment. Fear was the enemy, worse than any armada of any people. He tapped the press connection indicator, and as his image appeared in front of every reporter requesting a comment, he jumped ahead of them all and began to speak. The friendship will not happen twice. That was the promise made so long ago by President Taylor. We have kept that promise year after year through each administration. However, we must not forget the lesson that came with it, that contact with those who share not our ways is dangerous beyond words. They come with fire to instill fear in you, to take your children and yourselves as slaves, to destroy everything we value, from our freedoms to our families. Even now, as we welcome the first of our people home, more were taken from us, showing that there is no safety for mankind except in victory, that freedom can only be bought with blood, either ours or those who would take it from us. His rage was on full display, and his fierce, fanatical gaze seemed to lock on every man and woman who looked his way, whether he could see them or not. We will not be taken from. We will not be crushed. The Republic will spread out to cover every threat to us until there are no threats left. If they bring us war, we will bring the war to their doorstep. Look on the marked faces and hungry bodies of those who have come home from bondage. Will we let that happen to us all? I will not even if I have to fight from the very steps of the center of government. Not if I have to use my ancient desk as cover while I fire a rifle myself. They say they will give us death if we do not give up our liberty, and I say, give me liberty or give me death. Fear became rage as patriotic music began to play, orchestrated by his press secretary, and though he couldn't be sure, at their prompting it was likely that when the enlistment options appeared on screens around the Republic, that was her doing. Within hours of his speech, the Republic Senate had a one-page bill in front of them for voting, and this one-page bill had only one sentence. Let it be resolved that the Terran Defense Force shall have no restrictions on the budget or staff of its fleet or ground troops for the next 4 years, or until the war is brought to its conclusion, whichever comes first. Were it not for the now quiet rage that seethed inside of President Brown, he would have called it a very good day. How? How are they doing it? Praxajan's arms wrapped around his head to hide his face, and the horror he felt. It was only polite to do, and dire situation or not, but remembering his manners did nothing to change the dire nature of their situation. Why is a better question, cousin, Rorona remarked. His eyes were half closed with weariness, but in spite of the physical symptoms, his voice at least was as level and focused as ever. I think I can answer how easily enough. Fine, start with how and then we can get to why, Praxa exclaimed, and for once, with the absence of their highest priest, Rorona could relax and give his answer without fear of interruption. They are using the Kana Liberation Front. Finding the hyperlanes should have taken time, collectively buying us months to raise more defenses, but, as you know, some members of the Kana Rebellion managed to flee into the territory of the Terran Republic. I'm sure they're aiding our enemies, providing them with maps, layouts of defenses, anything they know of our territory, and since their race served as slaves all over our empire, I have no doubt the Terrans arrived in these systems already knowing what they needed to. We're scrambling to meet them, and we've destroyed a few ships, but cousin, we may need to surrender soon, if for no other reason than the Kana will want their crack at revenge. He reflexively looked at the place usually occupied by their mutual cousin, and it was almost odd to not hear the accusation of blasphemy being hurled his way. But odd or not, it remained a relief. Praxa unwrapped his arms as he forced his expression to one of neutrality. Then, why? Why are they doing that? As I tried to warn you before, Praxa, Rorona said as gently as he could. Cousin or not, he was still their ruler. Humans are often motivated more by principle than practicality. We enslaved their people, and for some reason that makes them very prickly. I admit, it is strange that they aren't enslaving the Kana. Perhaps they will later. But it appears to me that they employ a strange form of belief they call egalitarianism or equality. It makes all people equal under their laws, and they apply that even to species that are not their own. Preposterous. They exterminated the sacred dark, did they not? Not to mention the Idiaxa. Praxa's objection was meant to be a gotcha, but Rorona quickly denied it. No, the Idiaxa was imprisoned, but their people are now citizens. The sacred dark were made to give up their fleet life and now live on Terran Empire worlds. I thought for sure that I would find, as you did, extermination or slavery, but I found neither. And what spies report back from worlds where large numbers of the Kana live tell us that they set the Kana free and enlist them into their empire as free citizens. Rorona wanted to wrap up his own head in the same way, but he kept his expression blank and his hands folded together on the table. To put it bluntly, cousin, we're not only fighting humans. Battle reports on the ground report the presence of Idiaxa, Sacred Dark, and other minor species in their ranks. Few, but they are present, and they fight well. We are losing more because we have enemies in our own homes than because we have enemies outside of them. Rorona's words were an unthinkable admission, not just in that he acknowledged their steady defeat, but also the blasphemous reason of why they were being overthrown. A minor beep caught Praxa's attention. He tapped the source, and his body shook as he grew giddy. We are not going to lose now, Rorona. The Bavragan have attacked Terran worlds, and the Ko are on the move. If we hold on, they will be forced to retreat, and we can take back all that was lost, crush the Kana again, and then take the fight to the Empire of Man, turn this whole war around, and have so many slaves at our disposal that we will need to cull half their numbers just to make them manageable. This day hasn't ended so badly after all. Praxa said with a delightful air about him that Rorona could not mimic. The gods bless us after all. The House of Jean will rule for 1,000 cycles no matter what the humans try to do. Isn't that marvelous? Praxa's mood underwent a sudden turnaround, but as for Rorona, it did not. He answered only, yes, marvelous. It was the very first lie of his life. Target their atmospheric defenses and clear a landing spot for ground troops. Do it the usual way and keep the casualties as low as possible, Admiral Pike ordered. The usual way involved clearing substantial space outside of cities, occupying all areas where large quantities of food were grown and water was supplied, and then simply cutting supplies of both off from the population until the planetary government capitulated. All attempts at relief were destroyed by bombardment from above, and within a week or two, the planet would either devolve into chaos, infighting, or riots, and eventually surrender. She recalled an expression she learned at the academy. Any civilization, no matter how powerful, is only 9 meals away from collapse. While the Intakana seemed able to hold out at least a little bit better than the average human before devolving into violence to feed their offspring, she generally thought, that reflects either their religious devotion or their fear of their own government, or more likely both. But even so, it seems to hold true to within a 3-day period. The record was 12 days before surrender, with the fastest being on the same day under the watch of a particularly wise governor. She watched as the explosions detonated over Intakana military ground installations with the destruction of atmospheric weaponry. By now, they would have known to remove their personnel and scatter them, most likely into the cities where the fleet rarely struck. But even so, It would cost them many supplies, and more survivors meant more food was needed. The wide ships of the Terran ground forces began to move into position, hovering over at least 100 points on the world, and at a single beep, they began to descend in unison. Whoever is laying out their defenses is at least clever enough. They've started contesting our landings at their farmlands. She thought as the view switched to closer view through the camera of a transport ship. "We have to hold or our people starve!" The order given by Colonel Saraxalan was swift. The order was loud, but the snout of the presiding officer was stiff with terror. His entire body felt like leather. The fall of the water supply to his base had left them all on short rations. Like most living things, water was vital to survival for the Intakana, and its lack was crippling. Mercifully, the water supply to cities had not been cut off, but the military sources were just gone. Mobile bases. Whoever heard of something so insane? He wondered about that, but the answer was clear. Humans. Humans heard of them. The human transports were much larger than the Intakana confederations were, and at first most believed this to mean that the human armies were much larger than the norm, however. It turned out that the humans brought more equipment than anyone else did, and that equipment included modular military bases, small outpost models of dense metal that fit together like puzzle pieces and could hold 100 soldiers as well as AI turrets. Overwhelming them should have been easy, but their guns created a wide spread of enfilading fire that let these small bases control a large area, combined with bombardment from the Terran armada above. Overwhelming the little bases was impossible. And worse, he was now surrounded. "We have to hold on. If we can just hold on until the fleet arrives. If we can just hold on," the colonel repeated in his head as he watched the Terran ground forces begin their advance. Xenomorphs. He cursed them to the gods as they crested the hill, genetically modified monsters that raced on all fours over the ground, tearing out chunks and casting them aside as if they were at war with the world beneath their claws and not the living soldiers toward which they advanced. Xenomorphs were armored living weapons with AI-prompted implants that helped focus their instincts on the genetic signatures of those who they were set against. They had no sense of mercy to speak of and came in a few varieties of horror. Some used acid to melt bodies at medium range, others spat fire by igniting gas through their mouths, making them into living flamethrowers, while others used a poison cloud that took several hours to dissipate. The worst, however, were those who used a sticky webbing. The other forms of death were painful, yes, but they were swift. But if the Terran controllers didn't come on fast enough to rescue those thus trapped, the web users would use fangs to pierce the captive and drain their fluids while still alive in a death that would take more than an hour. The xenomorphs seemed to feel no pain, and so were hard to put down before they approached at close range to use their long, curved claw limbs and long double rows of serrated teeth. The very armor meant to help the Intakana infantry survive only dragged out the agony of their deaths. Heavy armor could crush them. Close explosions would destroy their organs. They could die, but they were legion. Then there were the genetically modified humans. A long-range round exploded a captain's head right beside Saraxa. The pink innards spattered as the body dropped. "Sniper!" he cursed. It was an ugly reality of fighting humans. "I believed we were apex predators, but this is another level," he cried out in his head as he dropped to the ground and scurried back into the building to take remote control of their position's defenses. His was the linchpin of the defense of their food supplies. As long as he held out, the cities would refuse to submit. The human depth perception was unusually good, and they created complicated weapons that took advantage of their natural desire to deal death at a distance, which was bad enough. But when he looked at the screen, he could see the drone cam identified a human frontline infantryman. Reactive armor plating protected his chest, and a helmet fully covered his head, giving the already alien being an even more terrifying appearance. His handheld semi-automatic weapon was tipped with a long, ugly blade for close combat. And that was the horrifying thing. Human soldiers didn't mind closing the gap. The soldier disappeared as he jumped into an Intakana trench. "Target that position! Take him down!" Saraxa shouted into the microphone. Even one human inside their positions was a disaster. Screams and wails were followed by a splash of blood that went up over the top of the little defensive position, and a half a dozen Intakana began scrambling out to flee. The drone caught sight of it, and Soraxa cursed again. Incoming rockets fell on the position, possibly taking out the human, possibly not. The red dust and clods of plants obscured his view. But what he did see was the next horror. Kana infantry were cresting the hill, alongside Idiaxa and sacred dark soldiers, each clad in armor tailored to them, and bearing Terran-made modified weaponry. The sound of rockets coming in and being shot down by his little base's automated defenses spoke of the inevitable end. Soraxa could feel it. Holding on against hope, he kept shouting orders into his automatic audio router to try something, anything, to stem the tide as the walls were overcome and the xenomorphs began attacking isolated buildings, locking down position after position until the human infantry and their alien lackeys fell in to begin to finish the brutal work. At least most of us won't be eaten, Soraxa thought as he watched them close in on his position and herald the end of his people as masters of their fates. When he awoke, weeks later, it was to the sight of a white and red-clad human standing over him, speaking into a translator telling him, "Welcome back. It looks like you're going to survive after all. I win my bet." It was the first relief the colonel had felt in months. President John Brown looked at the screen. The ascended co-representative was wreathed in darkness, as was their usual way. Thus far, no technology had been able to properly pierce the darkness to see them up close. Their religion, what he knew of it, held that they were born of black holes, and the closest they came to restoring themselves to their rightful place in the order of the universe was to wreathe themselves in an all-consuming darkness that even light could not illuminate. Humanity will pull back. The transmission was garbled, sounding much like a radio wave recording of nuclear tests. "Humanity will not pull back," John declared and leaned forward over his desk toward the transmitted black space. "Humanity will pull back, or the ascended co will kill you by the billions." The blackness declared, "We will bless your lives with death and teach you to humble yourselves before the birthers of the galaxy." "We refuse," President Brown said, his eyes staring deep into the dark, willing it to part to reveal the source of the voice. "They have taken our people's freedom. They aided in taking our lives. We will not give in, not to them, not to their allies, and not to you." "You will regret your choice," the black said. "Not as much as you will. It doesn't matter how strong you are, we are set upon a path we will not turn back from. We will never give in. Not until every slave is free. Not until every enemy of mankind has been broken on the shores of our will. We will fight to the bitter end, and it does not matter if you are stronger, the bigger you are, the harder you will fall." John's slender jaw was set like stone in his unwavering defiance, and the co-representative, wherever it was within the black, seemed to hesitate. "You will lose billions," he warned. "They will die free, and to set free millions in the process. That's a worthy cause to die for, far better than most could ever be. Do what you want, and see if you can live with the consequences as well as we can," John retorted. "No one has ever stood against a co-armada and won," the speaker replied. "Yet," John answered, and killed the transmission. Praxa Jean was practically dancing with glee as he watched the screen. The Ascended Co were bombarding a Terran world, and casualty estimates were coming in from Rorona Jean's department that put human deaths in the hundreds of millions. When Rorona entered the room, he didn't hesitate. "They did it! The Ascended Co have invaded the Terran Empire!" he shouted with delight. But his cousin did not, for reasons not readily clear, share his joy. Rorona approached the table and sat down, his drooping snout swaying a little and his long, thin arms folding together on the table in front of himself. "Didn't you hear me?" Praxa shouted with delight, a lot louder this time as he repeated himself about the invasion. "I know, cousin," Rorona replied. His voice, far from exuberant, was more stressed than ever. "Then why aren't you celebrating? The humans can't possibly win. They're at war with gods. What can they hope to do but die? Praxa cried out, almost desperately trying to pull joy out of his dour cousin's strained soul. "Computer," Rorona called out to their AI system, "bring up the recent transmissions that have gone up across the Terran Empire." The screen transitioned away from the site of the Ascended Co-Armada and to a public streaming service. "Buy war bonds! Build the ships that will save us all! Every purchase is an investment in our future. And if you have no credits, join the service. Take up the rifle, cannon, and ship and fight in every breach to keep back the nightmare. Will you stand between your homes and this?" The screen transitioned between the Terran Armada and the decimated world that was decimated a week earlier. "So?" Praxa asked. "So they aren't pulling back?" Rorona said, "They've continued to capture our systems. We've lost 2 more allies since that transmission, and 2 more worlds of our own. The Kana keep growing stronger too. Our entire plan hinged on the idea that against the overwhelming might of the Ascended Co, humans would give way. But they're not. I'm sure our cousin sacrificed his life to the Co to get their aid, but it isn't enough." Rorona finally let some emotion into his voice and shouted at the ruler of their empire. Praxa stepped back in shock at Rorona's words. "We have no fleet left. Just a handful of frigates and cruisers that are barely enough to handle pirates, let alone an entire Terran armada. The Co no longer matter. They came too late, and the humans aren't drawing back from us. I fear we have to surrender. If we do so now, we can get some good terms. We can gain protection against retribution from the Kana. We can save hundreds of millions of lives." "No!" Praxa shouted in horror. His entire body froze as if trapped in ice. It was unthinkable. But Rorona wasn't done. "They already hold billions of our people effectively hostage, and they've restrained themselves from slaughtering our cities. Strange as it sounds, it seems they've even treated our wounded. I don't know what to make of it. They crush our armies, and then heal the wounded afterward and let our captives go to live lives as civilians. Whatever the reason, I think it means we can get good terms. But if we don't yield, we have nothing left to fight with." Rorona let his hands fall from off the table to hang at his side. Praxa balled his hands into fists. "We will fight to the death. I don't care if we have to fight until the very last one of our people is in the grave. We will hold on until the humans surrender to the Co. Then we will reclaim our empire, slaughter the Kana until they are 1/100th of their current numbers, claim the human captives of the gods as slaves to replace the lost lives, and then dominate the rest of our treasonous allies in the same way. Our empire will rule as it was always meant to. No more compromise, and the Terrans will be remembered for their hubris in the face of divinity," Praxajan declared, and waited for his cousin to bow to his will as he always did. Rorona bowed his head. "Do you remember when we were young, cousin, and the question of which of us should rule between the 3 of us, and you offered to pit 100 of your supporters against 100 of mine?" "I do. You gave in to my will instead." Praxa replied, "And you have been faithful to me ever since." "Yes, but you never asked me why I gave in, so would you do me the honor of asking me why now?" Rorona replied. Praxa tilted his head a little. "Very well, I don't see the relevance, but why?" "Because you wanted it more than I, and I wasn't willing to let my mate get hurt by your ambition. You were clever, and I trusted that you would listen to reason. I thought you could rule at least as well as I could have. That is why I convinced our late cousin to join the priesthood and serve the gods, and bowed to your will then, as I always have." Rorona answered, and Praxa preened a little at that. "You have been faithful to me, but why do you bring that up now when we are so close to turning defeat into triumph?" Praxa asked. "Computer," Rorona said. "Playback transmission X24601, X42, X3.14, X001, and X69 in multi-screen mode." The videos blinked to life all at once. There was an obviously smuggled spy video showing no fewer than 20 battleships in various stages of production. There were 6 more being built on each of the following images, and then in the last screen, a projected path of the 3 Terran armadas that were closing in on the interior planets of what was left of the Intakana Empire. These cousin, have changed my mind about everything, and I am sorry," Rorona said in a quiet, reasoned voice. Praxa barely had time to comprehend those words while he watched the videos play before his eyes. When he did, and turned his eyes toward his cousin, he saw that Rorona was no longer seated. He was standing, and he was holding a weapon in his hand. The shot was like thunder, and Praxa didn't feel the pain for several seconds. He tried to move his limp snout to ask why, but already his strength was fleeing him, and his body was falling forward to die on the table from which he'd ruled his empire and run it into the ground. "You're probably wondering why, cousin, so as a parting gift I will tell you," Rorona said as he approached the limp and dying body. "As long as you ruled, President Brown would not have accepted any offer of peace. He is a fanatic on par with any of our priests. But if you are dead, I can negotiate an end, a surrender that will spare our people slaughter and suffering. We may lose our empire, but if studying our enemy has shown me anything, it is that defeat is sometimes more prosperous than victory. I will surrender, and I will do as the Kaksak did, offering myself as you never would have, if that will satisfy them. But if nothing else, I will ensure we continue even without you." Praxa Jean wanted to shout, to rage, to scream, to attack the traitor. But he couldn't move. He couldn't move, and soon he couldn't even feel his wound. His eyes went hollow, and the last thing he saw was Rorona reaching for the chair in which the masters of the empire had sat for centuries. The last thing he felt was the floor, as his body was dumped out of the way to let his cousin take his place. Then there was nothing. Not ever again. Rorona spared a pitying look at his cousin, and then said, "Open a diplomatic channel to the Terran Republic, and connect to the entire empire and military back channels on standby, public and secret nets." The computer obeyed, beeping as the connections began to link 1 by 1 and 10 by 10, leaving Rorona only a moment to think of what to say. It wasn't necessary, though. He knew what he had to do, and that was enough. Rorona Jean stood in front of the video monitor that would transmit his image and his words out to the whole of his empire, even the worlds that were currently occupied, if the Terran Empire didn't jam the signal. Though whether they'd done that or not, he was unsure. Emperor Praxa Jean is dead. He has taken his own life as a way to take responsibility for his failure to secure the Intakana Confederation's safety and future. With the death of our cousin, the ascended priesthood has no head, as Praxa did not appoint one before his ending. As such, I, Rorona Jean, ascend into the place of both of my cousins. I accept full responsibility for the war my cousin provoked, and am offering terms of surrender to the Terran Republic at this very hour. We have fought hard. For all the folly that led us to this place, no one will say that the Intakana were cowards in the final hour. As we fought with courage in war, let us now apply that courage to our future peace. I have never said so many lies in all my life put together as I've spoken in the last hour. Rorona thought with a faint sense of disgust in his gut. The only true thing in the hour-long speech was that the Intakana had fought with courage. I wonder if the humans could bear losing so many ships without making peace. It was an idle curiosity, but one thing he knew for sure was that their current president would tolerate it. His wild, fanatical drive made deception impossible, and it was that, far more than any military defeat, that convinced Rorona that the war's outcome was a foregone conclusion. How do you defeat someone for whom there are no unacceptable losses? He had no idea, but it convinced him of something else. Humans are insanely dangerous. They are a force of nature as implacable as gravity itself. The human slave rebellions had taken far less time to begin than the Kana, and the human slaves had taken brutality on their masters to a level never imagined possible. Worse, they were a third again as strong as Intakana, even without genetic modifications. Even if we won, we would just change the war from being far out in space to being in our own homes and cities as human slaves came within knife reach. In his nightmares, that thought came to pass, and if it had, the outcome was little in doubt. We would be extinct. We would be the first species to go extinct because of victory. Out of all the lies he told to the Intakana, there was one he told with a deeper purpose. He wanted the population anxious, thinking about the end of the war, to make their resistance crumble early. If he'd told them that the Terran president had already accepted the terms he offered, they might have been shocked, or thought it a trick, or started wondering about the conditions under which Praxa had died. Not that investigation would find anything. The body was already modified to reflect a self-inflicted wound, and within a few hours, his final message would confirm the truth. He doubted anyone would be much interested in looking into the matter, not when he made both a convenient scapegoat and a convenient martyr, bearing the blame in their place as well as being redeemed by his sacrifice at the end. The story had all the elements Rorona could have asked for in a cover story. In the distant future, after I'm dead, people will ask questions, look for evidence, offer speculation, and who can say? Maybe they'll even figure out the truth. But with this one death, I have saved us all. He told himself as he relaxed at ease in the ascended estate on the highest mountain of his homeworld. It was then that he really began to reconsider the humans' methods. Because I could expect mercy, I ended the fighting early. I wonder how many lives have been saved because one side did not need to fight to the bitter end. His snout bounced as he snorted, "Masters of war indeed," he thought, and waited for the Terran armada to arrive and begin the occupation of his homeworld. President John Brown wanted to dance with glee, but buried that desire beneath a somber face as he addressed the Terran Republic. The Intakana Confederation has officially surrendered. They are no more. Our fleets have split into groups to occupy their final worlds, and we will station 500,000 soldiers on each to ensure a peaceful transition into a new order of peace and democracy throughout their sectors. The terms of peace are available on the wider net, but here are the highlights. All Terran slaves are released with compensation for work performed while captives. The Kana are now free, and all Intakana occupiers are to be relocated to their home systems, with all property and resources left behind to compensate the Kana for their captivity. Overseers, slave traders, and owners of slaves on those worlds are to be sentenced to hard labor for 20 years before they are allowed to join the others in departure. However, a single Intakana death at any labor facility will result in the freedom of all other prisoners. The Intakana fleet is to be turned over to the Terran Republic, and the worlds we have captured will remain in our possession with no Intakana or other Confederation member races deported or deprived of property, granting them full rights as citizens of our Republic within 1 year, following a period of re-education to teach them what that means for them. The Kana are prohibited any off-world retaliation, and all slaving companies are to be broken up and set to compensating their former victims and arranging for the reunification of the broken-up families from around what was Confederation space. The remaining unoccupied Intakana will be turned into a protectorate state, pending a plan of broader integration into the Terran Republic. There were other points as well, but they were trivial, and already broadcasts showed the former Terran slaves being moved onto transports bound for the Terran Republic. Rorona either moves with uncommon speed, or he had this in mind before the proposal. It really makes me wonder if he had anything to do with Praxajan's suicide. It was an idle thought in the aftermath of his address, and far too irrelevant for him to spend much time on it. Even with the end of the war in the West, there was another problem. A transmission came in telling him exactly what that problem was too. Planet Xer has fallen to a co-invasion. John felt more of his hair turn white. Before checking the details of the message, he cycled over to the fleet construction report. "Another 3 months," he mumbled, but then went over to the recruitment report for the infantry. On 20 worlds, the numbers were tremendous, and some of those worlds were not too far away from the victorious fleets of the Western space. The order was obvious. Transmit orders to all fleets. Those not engaged in direct occupation are to return to our space, link up with ground forces at designated assembly systems, and chase the invaders off. He then sent a funding request to the Senate to allocate resources from the occupied Confederation worlds to the building of yet more battleships. No sooner than he'd sent that order than another message came in from the Ascended Co. "Submit to us. You have lost the fight." They sent one of those every single time they occupied a world, and they'd captured 9 worlds already. John usually ignored them, but this time he chose to respond. He hit the response icon and shouted, "I have not yet begun to fight," and then he killed the link again. Admiral Nelson of the Red Dawn never let his tension show to his subordinates. He left that to the AI scenarios he ran in private in the Hollow Suite, using the estimated power of the Co-starships to create battle scenarios. Defeat after defeat by the Ascended Co had 9 worlds overrun and occupied by those who styled themselves as gods by the time his armada, which he'd built on the move, even turned around. Admiral Pike was on the way to the same destination as himself, but as of right now it appeared she would have to divert her path to start recapturing occupied worlds. The population is committed now, but if we're humiliated at this stage, what good will all our previous victories do? That was the great concern. Other peoples were growing in power. Smaller nation-states and empires were being gobbled up by their neighbors, and according to the leading military experts and their advisors, it wouldn't be long before the Republic of Man could be rivaled by some fairly aggressive neighbors. Humiliation before them? Occupied worlds given back only with meek pleading and supplication? Armadas broken so badly that it would take decades to rebuild? We may as well lie down before our neighbors and hope they are not too rough with us. "How long until we get there?" he asked his navigation officer. 3 more months, sir." She answered with quiet dread. He hadn't forbidden the running of simulations against the Co, other than the ones that were official in nature. But if they had, and he was sure they had, they knew what he knew. That the Co Armada was more powerful than anything else humanity had ever faced. He recalled the words of the president, "Never surrender to humiliation. They hate our pride, for no one can be free and humiliated at once. They demand we call them gods, that we bow and scrape to beg forgiveness for our liberty, but I will not. We will not. We touched the face of God hundreds of years ago when we took to the stars, and we will never bow and scrape again. Fight them to the last drop of blood, until they feel a very human chill in their alien bodies and know that they are not gods, and they can die." Say what he would of the president, Nelson hadn't voted for him, but the man knew how to give a rousing speech, and he understood the danger in a grander sense than most others as far as the captain could tell. Losing a planet was a problem. Losing a war was a disaster. "Present position of the Co Armada?" he asked. "On the way to conquer their 12th world, a place called the Vale." She answered. He ignored her assumption that the Co would win, but scratched his chin. "Why does that name sound familiar?" He asked. It tickled a memory somewhere in his brain. "That's the common name for it." She answered. "Its formal name is Valetudinaria. The colony is settled mostly by military veterans who found it hard to adapt to civilian life." Recognition snapped into his mind. Everybody knew that colony. At least every military person. It offered free land and a modular home for every veteran willing to settle there and donate 1 day a week of work to terraforming an unsettled region. It was famous for its mountains and its beautiful, peaceful scenery. Surprisingly, it even welcomed veterans from the Sacred Dark, the Ediaxa, and other conquered species. "A soldier is a soldier," was the attitude of their governor, a retired general whose name escaped him at the moment. More famously than their residents, however, was the highly militaristic culture that governed the planet. A little smile was on his face for the first time in weeks. "Sir?" his navigation officer asked. "Is everything all right?" "Oh yes, everything is fine. I was just feeling sorry for them." Captain Nelson answered. "For the planet?" she asked with a sage nod. "No," he replied. "For the Co." Admiral Vorksa watched the Terran starbase crumble under withering fire. It, like most of their defenses, had been pathetic, far too weak to be worth much. So far, there hadn't even been a viable fleet to oppose him or his people. Ground defenses were light, too, with only a handful of police and a few militia organized by the local recruiting stations for their military. Citizen militia were armed, and there had been casualties. Darkness, damn them! There had been casualties. However, world by world, the Terran Republic gave way to the divinity of the Ascended Co. But there was a problem. Why don't they give in? He growled and tensed the finger claws of his hands which held onto his seat. That question was being debated heavily among the council. The one-time heretics of the Intakana had defied the divine will of the Ko. It had taken only a handful of battles to bring them back into the fold. The Bavragan needed only one battle to know never to encroach. And yet, they have 50 worlds and we've taken almost 1/5 of them. How can they not know they're beaten? He asked himself that a great deal, even on the worlds that were occupied, handfuls of humans continued to resist, hiding in the larger population and inflicting small acts of sabotage and murder. Begin the landing operation. Seize this Veil world. I want it brought to heel in 5 days. He ordered the troop transports to begin and watched them descend on the world below. The fleet would be held here while it was taken, but a few days of rest would be good for the fleet before moving on. 3 weeks later, he sat slumped in his chair looking at the latest disaster report. How exactly did they ambush us this time? He asked. They defecated on our life sensors to give the illusion of large numbers and laid something they call booby traps everywhere to kill those who came to capture or kill the imaginary army. The exhausted face of the co-ground leader was only a hint of the deep frustration that was being felt by the ones who actually go out and fight the maniacs. He exhaled hard. 2 days before it had been balloons of military equipment over top of generators to give a false heat signature. Before that, it had been disguising themselves using the skins of animals to get close. Before that, it had been secretly filling artillery with concrete in the middle of the night and then provoking a counterfire. And on top of that, it seemed there was a gun behind every rock and blade of grass. We are gods. Have we finally found devils? The Admiral wondered as the chill ran down his spine. Should we split the fleet? That was the 9th time that had been asked in the last month. Admiral Vorksa glanced at the screen. The world below was in ruins. It hadn't had major cities, but those small ones it held were now more or less flattened. He swiped his hand in front of the screen and the camera began to pan. Valleys that once had a small river were now still flooding. I can't believe they lured us in there and then detonated their own dam. 3,000 gods had died that day, with more requiring bodily augmentation to live functional lives, and then there was all that precious equipment. Somehow they'd stumbled upon a massive human army, and they weren't even halfway to the Sol system. No, they are only human. If we leave, then we are saying we are struggling, and gods do not struggle. They are merely stubborn Zeti burrowing deep within the dirt to avoid being stomped on. If we dig them out of their nests, they will die quickly. We need only keep doing as we do, without being foolish about it, and we will win. The Admiral's words usually would have resulted in echoed approval, but now? Sir, with respect, are we not being reckless? We have lost more in this one battle than we have lost in all divine punishments in the last 5,000 years. This race, it is mad, crazed, beyond reason. We are deep within their territory. The first officer's concerns were quashed at once when Admiral Vorksa slammed his fist upon the table. And we will go deeper. They will crumble. We need only keep pushing them until they surrender. Then from here we will move on from world to world until we reach their home system. Then, when we have captured Sol, and they bend in worship to us and accept their natural place beneath their gods, we will be able to go home again. I understand that, sir, but they have 3 armadas en route to us now. The first officer objected again, and this prompted the scales of the other co-officers to rattle. Objecting once was one thing, but twice. Vorksa's scales began to turn red with anger. What of it? He demanded. As I tried to say, sir, this came in at the start of this cycle. The first officer committed another breach of protocol and swiped the screen away, instead bringing up a transmission. They land! They come back! They come back! It was a meaningless message until the first officer brought up the stellar map again and pointed to the world of origin, and the co-signal transmission stopped. The humans retook a world we took from them. They send transports from 5 or 6 worlds around our occupations, and are descending on others. They are winning back what we have conquered, and still their fleet comes on. while we sit here fighting on a world that has nothing on it to fight over, except for who controls it. The first officer's words created a rattle in the scales of all the present gods. This world does not matter. To humiliate the Terran Empire, we must take Seoul. Fighting over this world is pointless except that we have already begun it. We need to move, the first officer declared, and Vorksa sat sullen and displeased as he looked at the stellar map. No. If we destroy their armadas, that will break them. They must be exhausted already from losing to us. One more victory and we are triumphant, the admiral declared, and a rumbling of approval finally was delivered as it should have been. As if we need fear defeat. We are gods. What are these but mere apes of a backwater world? His scales rattled in disgust as he went about approving new operations to hunt down the local resistance. They'll run out of tricks soon enough. We only have to keep going, he told himself as his confidence reasserted itself again. I would give a long speech to you about your bravery and courage and the fight for our future, but there's no need for that. President Brown said in front of the line of ships. You are brave, and for the brave, a few words are as good as many. Go, fight, destroy the Co. And whether you come back or not, you will live forever in our memories, and forever in their nightmares. Hurrah! 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 The voices of the tens of thousands of crew members went up. Space Marines in their customary black armor raised up their guns, pumping their arms with every cheer. They came from all corners of the Republic, and their war cries and dread vision dominated the screens, not just within the Republic itself, but outside of the Republic where curious onlookers expected to watch the nascent power of the Terran Republic crumble to dust before being swept into the ashbin of history. But it made a very fine moment, no matter the expectations of the onlookers. The ships were the latest models of battleship. They'd taken even longer than usual to build because the designs had to be updated halfway through the construction. John ran a hand through his hair as soon as the cameras were gone. More of it was white than before, he knew, because he could see it reflected in the hull of the nearest battleship. I swear I gained a new white hair every single day after that decision to upgrade the fleet. He thought to himself as he suppressed the shaking of his body, channeling it instead into his relentless work ethic. As the soldiers boarded their respective battleships, he made his way to a private office. Transmissions were waiting for him already. Give up these systems without a fight, and we will take no more. Just a few territories, and we will have peace. There will be peace in our time, if we only have a little more. It is a small price to pay, isn't it? There were dozens of them from surrounding governments. Some of them were very small, relative to the Republic. Some of them were much larger, rivaling the Republic in size or surpassing it. None had declared war. Yet. But with the loss of 12 worlds thus far, and the promise of losing more before a proper fight in the stars could even be made, I feel like a wounded lion just watching buzzards circling overhead. They are waiting for me to die and all my strength to be useless before they come down to tear me apart. He thought as he crafted his responses with care. To the weakest places that were trying to just snip off an opportunistic corner of the Republic, he sent outright refusals. To the others he sent no response, except an offer of trade agreements, while quietly routing a warning to the Senate to fund the building of more armed starbases at hyperlane choke points. We're spending on a deficit right now. We can't do that forever. But if we stop now, we may as well lie down and lick boot. We're finished, John told himself, and down to his soul, he knew he was right. The battle ahead would decide what would happen for humanity, and the weight he felt on him was such in that moment that he was glad he was sitting down. He reached for a bottle and popped a pill. The pain there went away, at least for the moment. But it would be back, just like the endless demands. And his console went off again, revealing that a group of pirates was settling up in an area where the local militia had been broken and was threatening to link up with planetary crime lords to create their own little ideal domain. This is how nations die. They need more than they can create, and they exhaust themselves. The thought passed briefly through the president's mind before he began working out a solution to answer the local governor's concerns. Admiral Pike clung to her sense of reason as the sunless days continued on board her flagship. Every time we think we're safe, it gets worse, she thought as she sat up in bed, her black skin beaded with sweat despite the environmental controls meant to make her quarters comfortable. The sweat had nothing to do with the temperature, it was the dreams again. For near the entirety of President Brown's administration, the war had continued onward, and it was draining them all. Defeating the Intakana Confederation had provided some relief, but the Bavragan mercenaries had opened the door to an invasion by the Ascended Co, and they seemed unstoppable. Over 20% of Terran Republic worlds were occupied, only finally stopped by a unique problem that nobody believed would stop them for much longer. And everybody was just tired. We're so damn tired. Starship crews are supposed to cycle out into periods of rest to get planetside every now and then. Nobody is supposed to fight this long. She thought, and tried to recall the particulars of her nightmare. She knew she wasn't the only one suffering from this wartime fatigue. The counselors now had counselors of their own, and the drills had to be cut in half just to provide extra downtime in order to keep the crew as energized as they were. That was merciful in a way. She looked as bad as the rest of them. We're all in the same shit, and that makes it easier to bear, she thought as she rose and began to clean herself up to get ready for another long shift. A communication indicator came on, and the computer relayed the details without her asking for it. This is Captain Nelson of the Red Dawn. Ma'am, it's good to be in Instacom reach with you again. Task Force return will be arriving at Sector Sigma for our rendezvous in 30 days. With luck, we'll arrive on the same day as you and Task Force Liberty. The younger captain's voice was not much less exhausted than her own, but she made no comment about that, instead saying, "Tell me the truth. What do you think our chances are? If we catch them with their pants down trying to take another shit on one of our worlds?" he asked. It was crude. It was out of regulation. It was unprofessional, and it felt absolutely right. It was also fair to ask, after all, it was still possible the Co might choose to abandon conquest of the world below them and instead choose to attack a softer target. Chasing after them seemed somehow worse. Her lack of response to his question seemed to suffice for an answer in his mind, and he answered the Admiral with a more dignified and professional stoicism. "I don't know, I really don't. I've never met Admiral Yi before, but he's supposedly a genius tactician, and we certainly have the numbers on them. Our fleets are the best they can possibly be." "Under the circumstances," she interjected. "Under the circumstances," he admitted before going on, tacitly acknowledging the exhaustion of his own crew after a 7-year war that had turned disastrously wrong right when it seemed it might end. "I've gone over the plan as thoroughly as you have, ma'am, and even outnumbering them 5-1. I just don't know." "Yi sent out something yesterday. Did you receive it?" she asked. "Yes. He said we have an advantage they don't have, and we're going to use that to force them to retreat." Captain Nelson cleared his throat and said, "We know how to lose." It made no sense to me. I hoped you'd know what he meant, I sure don't. But on another note, you're being promoted to Admiral. Congratulations. She said it so offhandedly that he almost missed it. The weariness of his mind was such that he barely registered it as a positive. "Thank you, Admiral." He said it without enthusiasm. "I'll try to live up to the rank." "I know." She replied to him at once, similarly nonplussed. Numb was now their new normal, and as such, she hadn't expected a cheer, and nobody was doing ceremonies for anything anymore. "I'll see you when we reach the Veil, and hopefully, I'll see you on the other side of it," she said as solemnly, and killed her transmission side. "Same to you, Admiral." He answered, and killed his side, thus completing the termination of their link. Day slipped into day with a kind of blessed monotony for the rest of the month, as news continued to come out about the situation on planet Valetudinaria. The Co-soldiers continued to land, and there were no more major settlements unoccupied. However, much to the relief of the Terran Republic, the Co had no interest in taking slaves, nor in massacring the inhabitants. They came, they fought, and almost seemed to follow a Republic model of rules of war, with no conception of how to fight a dirty war. A failing that allowed the colonists to continue to resist in the hinterlands or in the occupied settlements. But the Co were still winning. It was just slow. President John Brown seemed almost beyond the very concept of exhaustion to those who knew him. Each day he rose, went before the Senate, proposed solutions and allocations of resources regarding problems, and otherwise displayed no hint that he was troubled by the conflict. No hint but one. His hair was turning whiter by the day, as if every problem slew a follicle. As if he was drawing on the years of his life for strength, he continued his nightly broadcast. "We are not defeated until we surrender, and if we never surrender, we are never beaten." He'd said it 1,000 times, it seemed, but little by little its efficacy waned, and really it was only the resistance of the veil that held humanity together at this stage. "If we lose this, the Senate will force my hand." He pursed his lips as he straightened up his suit with a slight tug at the base of his coat. Committed as he was to the Republic, he often couldn't help but think, no wonder people like dictatorships. The decision is made and it's done. No compromise necessary when you know you're right. He shook his head, frowning at his own impure thought. We fight to the bitter end, whatever that means. He resolved and left his office to go and get to work again. Admiral Yi watched the map of systems continue to shrink as the task force closed in on their destination. The Veil existed in a unique system, and the unique system had created a unique world, one tailor-made for those who knew it well. He showed no sign of weariness. His forces were fresh and, though untried, he drilled them relentlessly and uncompromisingly on the known data of the Co warships. The Co have very advanced ships, but they have no true conception of what it is to fight a long war, nor do they know what it is to lose. The warrior heritage of humankind was deep and wide as an ocean, born from the first moment two cavemen picked up rocks to slaughter one another with, and only growing greater as time had gone on. By contrast, in all his studies of the ascended Co, they were used to showing up, winning a battle by overwhelming might, and then having demonstrated the uselessness of resistance, returned home to receive worship and tithes from their puppets. When the hyperlane was close on his monitor, he only nodded at his navigation officer. Go. It wasn't a grand speech, it was just an order. That was all it took for the sailor of the void to act, and the stars became blurs as his fleet rushed to link arms with his counterparts into one single whole that was 3 times the size of the one that had brought the sacred dark to heel years before. It would have been impressive if it hadn't been backed by war bonds and debt spending that would take 20 years to repay if they were lucky. Better in debt than in the grave, Yi thought, and on his screen the 2 faces of his counterparts appeared. Admiral, they all said at once, and a rare smile touched their 3 faces in the same moment. Do you think they know we're coming? Admiral Pike asked. I don't see how they couldn't, but they're so hidebound by their own rules that they haven't moved their fleet out of position to meet us at the hyperlane exit. I think they won't move until we show up. Once we do, they'll leave planetary orbit to keep us from targeting their ground troops. Correct. Yi agreed with a nod. Just remember, stick to the plan. Do not move in until I give the order. I know it is counterintuitive, but you will have to trust me. Admiral Nelson and Admiral Polk both inhaled deeply through their nostrils, then gave reluctant nods of their own. All we can do is go forward and hope for the best. There's no more planning to be done. There's only do or die. Admiral Pike added, but Admiral Nelson chuckled a little, drawing curious expressions from both Yi and Pike alike. Not exactly. Do and die is also an option, he said, and began a long, dark laugh at his own gallows humor. It spread from him to his counterparts, and for the first time in a long time, they had much-needed laughs of their own, before they killed their lynx and set a course to see what would happen next. Admiral Vorksa shivered as he looked at the screen. They must be gathering their courage to die. He had heard that suggestion hurled at the humans many times now. The 3 armadas were certainly large, and a few officers who were more weary than the others had suggested the nigh unthinkable. Abandon our position to go fight them? No, no, no. he thought, and that seemed to be just what the humans wanted. For almost a month, as one fleet after the other appeared in the Sigma system, none of them moved beyond what appeared to be routine drills or maintenance. It was as if they were trying to lure Vorksa's armada out of position. Not a chance. They're a tricky species, certainly, and they might have hidden troop ships ready to come in and reinforce the Veil before we can return. That would drag out our conquest for months more, but why don't they all just give up already? Over a dozen worlds and not a victory to their name. With this, the Co would be only a few hyperlanes from the Sol system, where most of the Terran Empire's shipyards were still located. It grated that this world had been directly in their path, but fortified by man and nature alike or not, its existence meant that protocol required it be taken to ensure no problems lay behind them. Ever committed to doing things the right way, even if the Terrans refused to cooperate, he persisted. And now it was finally paying off. The human armadas that had linked up at Sigma were now moving. The advanced sensors of the Co vessels had the speed and trajectory mapped down to the span of a single finger, and with that, he sent the signal out to the rest of his armada. Bombardment would need to cease temporarily, and ship-to-ship weapons powered up. The human vessels were slower, but like the great ice ages that had come and gone on the worlds of the ascended Co, their coming seemed inevitable. At least it meant there was no hurry. Everything in its own time. A few days of rest for the crew will do them good. We can face the humans well-rested when they reach us. He thought, and that seemed a very good idea indeed. Yi bit back the urge to tell the others to stick to his instructions. They each had their part to play in the overall battle strategy, and a code that the Co could not possibly break was to be their guide. The code was not an encryption, but rather music. As they exited the hyperwarp, the strings of the 1812 overture began. The subtle sounds were peaceful at first, settling the souls of mankind as minute died and birthed each new minute after it. The monitors of hundreds of ships showed the ascended Co leaving orbit and taking up a formation to advance against the humans, doing just as their standard playbook told them to do. Not yet, Yi said softly to no one in particular. The ships were moving in, massive long objects of doom for uncounted ages, older than mankind. The fallen empire retained more power than will to use it, and so the fleet coming on constituted the overwhelming majority of their forces. The first torpedoes began to launch from Co vessels, some of them larger than the frigates of Terran ships. Each one spelled doom for someone. Not yet, Yi said under his breath again, as he watched the Co advance reach the outskirts of the system's sun. Terran ships were taking up their formations, an aggressive diamond formation for the bulk, with smaller, faster ships on the wings, the flagships of the Admiralty buried in the middle and ready to take point when needed. Still, the Co vessels came on. The Terran interceptor vessels launched to try to take down the armored torpedoes of the Co to prevent the destruction of some unfortunates. Blasts of light struck the tips, the center, the rockets of the torpedoes, but whether the light was plasma or lightning, it was as if they fought the winds of the storm with a mere handheld fan. And as the Co formations spread out in their broad line, meant to allow maximum fire and a myriad of targets that their doctrine said should be easily destroyed, Yi whispered to himself again as his fist clenched tight enough to turn his knuckles white. Not yet. The music picked up the pulses and pumping blood of the human listeners who understood it instinctively as indicative of rising action. Weapon systems were primed, torpedoes loaded, and energy blasts a dozen times more powerful than anything used in the Idiaxa War were waiting to be unleashed. Hold, Yi whispered again. Sir, we're detecting something unusual. His science officer spoke up and all eyes on the bridge turned to him. From the star, the crescendo struck, and the cannons erupted over every comm channel at once, and with it, the star erupted in a series of massive plasmic flares, which struck outward in space and lanced across 100 Co ships in one single moment of glorious light and destruction. Now! Yi shouted, and the Terran armadas leapt their ships forward as they pumped power into their engines. A few ships erupted into the fires of damnation as they were destroyed by torpedoes, but there were yet hundreds more following. "Unleash hell!" Admirals Pike and Nelson bellowed, and the music victorious of Adrian von Ziegler sent out a wave of drums and pipes to match the spirit of the fleet. Hundreds of torpedoes and missiles became thousands, and the formations of light ships on the wings zipped ahead with war cries in the throats of those resolved to conquer or die. Cries the Zoe could not understand any more than they understood what horror had fallen on them as their shields were nearly crippled, and a number of ships too close to the star died and added their debris to its mass forever in an instant. "What happened? Damage report!" Admiral Vorksa shouted the command as the true horror of the situation was already taking shape in his head. Have they figured out how to cause that? He asked himself, but it seemed impossible. No, it was impossible. If they could, they'd have done it by now, or even if this was their first use, why not use it twice? Doesn't matter. We have to win first. He threw the thought aside and hastened to give out his orders. Advance and destroy. Intact ships move in front of those too damaged to fight. Admiral Pike watched the destruction with the giddiness of a schoolgirl. With the shields of large parts of the ascended Ko fleet badly depleted, her own ships stood a fighting chance. "Hammer those fuckers like nails," she ordered, and the quickening drums were a call to the blood of warriors back 1,000 generations. Exhaustion was forgotten, the fear of defeat was forgotten. There was only the drums of war and their guns. The blazing fire of the massive armada continued to hammer the Ko vessels, and the triangle formation of vessels began to split apart, spreading out targets and opening up yet more withering fire on the damaged vessels of the undefeated Ko. The flaring of the shields of their enemies were like celebratory fireworks to the eyes of the Republic vessels, and when the fireworks died, so did the ships. The thick armor of Ko vessels was meant to hold up against weakened, diminished opponents whose vessels had been destroyed or damaged by overwhelming fire, while the majority of their protection lay in powerful shields. But with their destruction, Ko vessels began to shake, as if the very ships of the mighty ancients were now afraid of the horde of monsters that fell on them like packs of wolves. Half the fleet was dead before Admiral Vorksa shouted, "How can this be happening?" The answer from the universe was a flare of light from a Terran missile that seemed as massive as a star on his monitor before it broke through the cracked armor and smashed his bridge in one blinding final moment before all went dark for him and all his crew forever. The blasts back and forth continued unabated, but the end was certain long before the end, and the Terran Republic learned something else of the Ko doctrine that day. They had no regulations or processes for strategic retreat, as if they had never imagined that defeat was even possible. Though they were down to 1/10 of their numbers, they continued firing and flying through space as much as they could. Even when there was only one ship left, reality was seemingly denied as impossible, right up until it exploded. "Bring up the transports, land reinforcements, and take back this world. Admiral Pike, Admiral Nelson, excellent work. Take your fleets and 1/3 of the transports each, and begin reclaiming captured colonies." Admiral Yi ordered, and on screen, 2 sweating faces appeared, panting with exertion, as if they'd fought the fight by hand in the old ways. "Of course," Admiral Pike said, speaking first. "But can I ask, what was that? A new weapon?" "No, it was old knowledge. The sun here is highly prone to flares when magnetic fields get entangled, and that happens every few hundred years. I studied the star charts for this region and all events tied to it going back for centuries, and an old alien recording showed the ideal conditions so well that it was more or less a countdown. I just had to know when the tides were in our favor, so to speak, and put the Ko there. They may be brave, but they are not thorough." Yi smiled a little bit and winked at his counterparts. A genius indeed. The two thought quietly as the connections were cut, and all 3 went about their duty to the Republic with spirits renewed by an unprecedented victory. 40 Terran ships died despite the advantage, But there were no Ko remaining in the area, except on the planetary surface, which were in no position to do anything about the Republic fleet hovering over their heads, let alone the uncountable reinforcements of xenomorphs, handlers, and genetically modified soldiers equipped with state-of-the-art weaponry and support logistics. Exactly how long it would take to crush the invaders was uncertain, but as communications were established with the surface resistance, and landings began that would encircle the Ko military positions, Admiral Yi could be sure of one thing at least. It won't take long. The news of the victory at the Battle of the Veil swept over Republic news networks like wildfire, for not only was it a victory bought by drowning the Ko in the blood of humanity, but rather it was an overwhelming triumph. The details were unmentioned, but the casualty lists were short, and dozens upon dozens of science vessels were already moving to go and analyze the shattered material of the Ko vessels. Academics with no interest in war were very interested in the fruits of success. But for most, it meant something else. We're not losing. We're not going to lose. We're going to win. War bond sales went up 300% in the day after the victory spread out over the Republic. Agitators among the Intakana and other former members of the Confederation immediately fell silent, stricken with horror that those who they held as gods could be overthrown. Rorona Jean, on learning of the triumph of the human fleet, could only shake his head. "Curse you, cousins, for ever taking us into battle against the slayers of our people's gods," he thought, and went back to doing his best to make sure nobody fomented a rebellion, more sure now than before that he would succeed in making a lasting peace. On the Ko homeworlds, the fallen empire reacted with abject horror. With no fleet to protect their soldiers, and Terrans ruling the skies again, landing tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of soldiers, their armies began to dwindle and die, or worse, do the unthinkable, and surrender to those they intended to make into faithful worshippers. The prisoner tallies began to rise, and their own much-valued soldiers fell into the hands of humanity. The transmission of the Terran president was playing on a loop in their council chambers, as the Ko leadership argued over what to do. "Give up your war, and we return your people." It was a simple statement, and the result of refusal was already clear in the reports of 9 armies that had come into contact with large Terran ground troops, along with their sky-dominating fleets. Death. There was no question in their minds of what order to give after that. Pull back. Admit nothing, but pull back. The simple 3-sentence order saw the last 9 worlds abandoned without a fight, with Ko armies taking to the skies and fleeing for home as fast as their troop ships could carry them. Within another month, there were no Ko-occupied worlds, and Admiral Yi's words made sense to Admirals Nelson and Pike. They aren't used to taking serious casualties, so doing so strikes terror into their whatever passes for hearts. Their spirit for war was weakened by centuries of easy victories, and now they can't bear to lose as much as we can. Genius. Admiral Pike praised the man as she oversaw yet another bloodless triumph on a border world. And just like that, the war simply petered out. President John Brown lay quietly in his bed after a long day full of speeches and celebration, shaking the hands of heroes as the Ko sent a single statement across the Terran net. "We go home. Do not visit us or we will destroy you." It was as close to a peace treaty as the ancients ever entered into. That night, President Brown went to sleep with a smile on his face that he hadn't worn in years. To the shock of scores of worlds, he did not wake up. In the aftermath of the conflict, events flowed like driftwood over a raging river. The captured Ko who had not pulled back in time were sent home in exchange for the Ko interceding with the Bavragan to compel the return of the captured humans, thus neatly avoiding a continuation of the war by President Brown's successor. Though many would say that the death of President Brown was the luckiest they could have been, as had he lived, he certainly would have prosecuted a war of principle to crush the mass of mercenaries on the doorstep of the Terran Republic. His successor, Vice President Kenneth Chambers, saw fit instead to accept a victorious peace that would also allow a smooth transition into power for the last year and some of the president's term. He remarked on the day in which he took office, "Oh, my captain, our fearful trip is done." And thereafter measures were swiftly presented as a way to honor the late president's contribution to the future of the Republic, namely in the form of providing funds for re-education and general teaching for the sudden inclusion of tens of billions of new citizens into the Terran government, teaching them their rights, how voting and elections worked, and the tiered system of rule that ensured planets could run the day-to-day while still contributing to the strength of the while. Unsurprisingly, Kana mourned the death of their human liberator as deeply as any Republic citizen, and they enlisted into the Republic military in the tens of millions. When Rorona Jean learned of the death of the late president, he was in the middle of composing a speech of his own, encouraging his people to adapt to change rather than to resist it, and his thoughts and feelings ran in two different directions. Yes, he was my enemy. But if all enemies comported themselves so with the vanquished, there would be less enmity in the galaxy. It was as high a praise as he felt right giving under the circumstances, and he returned to work thereafter, without missing a beat. The other fallen member states of the late Confederacy seemed to content to continue their tradition of following Inta-Kana lead, and within a few months, political parties styled after the Terran Republic models were springing up like weeds. The deficit spending was ended by the deaths of so many excess ships in the final Great Battle, and they were simply not rebuilt. Admirals Nelson and Pike closed out the war as most of the rest of the Republic did, by trying their best to drink the nearest planet dry of alcohol. They sat across from one another in the officers' club with a slew of empty bottles between them and their respective staffs. Most of both groups had passed out entirely, and the ones who weren't face down on the table and snoring were close enough to it that it made no difference. The usual restrictions had been briefly lifted both to celebrate the end and to properly mourn the loss of the leader whose call to liberty made it nigh insane for any race to deal in Terran slaves. "I suppose Yi was right," Susan said thoughtfully. Her amber eyes were glassed over, but after the stupendous way in which Admiral Yi had duped the Co into damaging their fleet so badly, she felt the need to discuss it further. "Yes, he was. They just couldn't take the casualties on a morale level. All that power and they get one shartling moment and they just give up." Nelson hiccuped as he slurred his words. "What a way to win." "Do you think we'll fight them again?" Susan Pike asked as she began to see doubles of her counterpart. Nelson looked down at the bottom of his bottle. There wasn't much left in it, so he chugged the last bit of bourbon and savored the feeling of its burn going down his throat, then replied, "How many shides are there in this galaxy?" he asked. Susan thought it over. Her fuzzy, alcohol-soaked brain had a hard time counting known empires near and far, and she began working the answer out on her fingers before Nelson evidently grew tired of waiting and answered. "Just 2. He held up a fist. "There's the Republic, and everybody who hidin' in it. Only real question-ish. Which one of them we gonna fight next?" It was more than a drunken rant. It sounded more like an ominous prophecy, but one she was ill-equipped to refute. It did, however, ruin her desire to keep drinking, and she returned to her quarters to sleep off the booze, leaving Nelson to pass out at the table on his own eventually. Admiral Yi proved one thing above all else. He understood the nature of the Ascended Co's true weakness as no one else ever had. They had never suffered mass casualties, nor had they fought a protracted war against a strident and unyielding opponent. With enough strong ships, the gap in power could be bridged, and with sufficient knowledge of the space of battle, the tide could be turned to his advantage. He, unlike most of the Republic, was sober, having given up alcohol decades before. Instead, he celebrated by reading a new book, enjoying a quiet soda, a little music, and the brief quiet calm of peace that followed the end of war. As the winsome symphony air and simple gifts began to play within his quarters, he reflected on all that had come and gone for the Republic since the war began. "We won't end up in a war again for a very long time, not unless we're unlucky enough to elect a fool. After beating one of the ancient races of the galaxy, no matter how narrowly it was, The other empires will think twice about tangling with us, at least for a time, but that won't last. It can't. Peace, after all, is nothing but the period of time between two wars, but at least I can enjoy it for now, while we have it. He thought, and turned the page of his book with a smile as he enjoyed the quiet music that was his reward for a job well done.